He left his village with nothing, not even a plan. But what he came back with, no one expected it. Michael Mwangi was born in the quiet village of Kirangi in Nakuru County, found in Kenya, a place tucked between rolling green hills and dusty red roads where everyone seemed to know each other's story before it was told. Life there moved with the rhythm of the sun, early mornings, long days, and evenings filled with the distant sound of radios and laughter drifting from small homes. He was the second born in a modest family of 5 children, always caught between expectation and freedom, watching, learning, questioning. His elder brother, David Mwangi, carried the quiet burden of being the firstborn, often expected to lead by example even when he was still figuring life out himself. David was dependable, steady, the kind of young man neighbors trusted without question. He often stood in for their father when work called him away. And though he rarely complained, there was always a certain weight behind his eyes, as if he had learned too early that life did not bend easily. Below Michael were his 3 younger siblings, Faith Mwangi, whose laughter could fill a room even on the dullest days. She had a natural warmth about her, always quick to mediate arguments or turn tension into something softer, but beneath that lightness was quiet strength. Faith noticed everything. She understood people in ways even adults didn't, and often became the emotional glue that held the family together during difficult times. Samuel Mwangi, curious and restless, always taking apart things just to see how they worked. He was always asking why and how, his hands constantly busy, his mind rarely still. Teachers often complained that he couldn't sit through lessons, but those who paid attention could see it wasn't disobedience, it was a mind that refused to be confined. In many ways, Samuel mirrored a different path Michael might have taken, and the youngest Esther Mwangi, small in stature but quietly observant. She spoke less than the others, but when she did, her words carried surprising depth. Esther had a way of seeing things others missed, the tension in a voice, the meaning behind silence. She admired Michael deeply, often following him around without saying much, simply wanting to be near him. To Michael, she was more than a little sister. She was a reminder of innocence, of softness in a world that could easily harden a person. Together, they formed a bond shaped by shared struggles and small joys, the kind that only families who grow up with little truly understand. Each of them, in their own way, would come to shape Michael's path, pushing him, grounding him, and sometimes challenging everything he thought he knew about responsibility, ambition, and what it truly meant to succeed. His father, Benson Mwangi, worked long shifts at a small metalworks factory known as Kirangi Iron Works, where the clang of steel and heat of the furnace shaped both metal and men. Benson was a quiet man, not one for many words, but his actions spoke loudly. He never missed a day of work unless he was truly unable to stand. To him, responsibility was not a choice, it was a duty. Michael's mother, Mercy Mwangi, was a primary school teacher at St. Kirangi Primary School, the only school within walking distance for most children in the village. She carried herself with a calm strength, the kind that made people listen even when she spoke softly. At home, she was both gentle and firm, always reminding her children that education was the one thing no one could ever take from them. Mercy's words were not the kind that echoed loudly in the moment. They stayed. They settled somewhere deep, the way rainwater disappears into the soil, only to feed something unseen. Michael didn't always realize it then, but much of what he would become had already been quietly planted in those early mornings at the wooden dining table, where his mother would sit with a cup of tea gone cold, reviewing exercise books while reminding them, almost absent-mindedly, to never take learning lightly. Their home had 2 small rooms and a narrow sitting area that doubled as everything from a study space to a place where guests were received, but it was alive. Always alive. There was always movement, always sound. The clatter of utensils in the morning, the low murmur of Benson's radio tuned to the news in the evenings, Samuel's endless questions bouncing off the walls, Faith's laughter cutting through tension like sunlight through clouds. And in the middle of it all was Michael, not the loudest, not the quietest, but always present in a way that made people notice. He had a habit of watching things closely before speaking. Even as a boy, he seemed to understand that words carried weight, and once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. So he observed. He listened. He studied people the way Samuel studied broken radios. And when he finally spoke, it was often with a clarity that surprised those around him. School came easily to him not because it was simple, but because he treated it like something worth understanding rather than something to get through. At St. Kirangi Primary School, where his mother taught, he quickly became known as one of the more promising students. But being the teacher's son was not always a blessing. If anything, it made things harder. Mercy never showed him special treatment. If anything, she expected more. Others can afford to be average, she once told him quietly after marking his test. You cannot. It wasn't said harshly, just plainly, and Michael understood. He would often stay behind after class, not because he was forced to, but because he wanted to understand what lay beyond the lesson. While other children rushed out to play football in the dusty field, Michael sometimes sat at the back of the classroom, flipping through worn-out textbooks, tracing ideas that stretched beyond what was written on the blackboard. It wasn't isolation, it was a curiosity, but he wasn't removed from the life around him, far from it. After-school responsibilities waited. In a home like theirs, everyone contributed. Michael and David often fetched water from the communal tap a few hundred meters away, carrying heavy jerry cans back home with practiced balance. Sometimes they worked in the small patch of land behind the house, turning soil, planting maize or beans, depending on the season. On weekends, Benson would take one or both of them along when he had small side jobs repairing metal gates, welding broken hinges, fixing tools for neighbors. Those were some of the moments Michael learned the most. Not from instructions, but from watching his father work. Benson never rushed. Even when tired, even when the sun was unforgiving, he worked with patience, measuring twice, cutting once, fixing things properly, not just quickly. And when something went wrong, he didn't complain. He adjusted. Do it well, he would say, without looking up. Or don't do it at all. It sounded simple, but Michael understood there was more behind it. It wasn't just about work, it was about character. Evenings brought a different rhythm. The family would gather, sometimes around a simple meal of ugali and sukuma wiki, sometimes just tea and leftover bread. Those were the hours where stories were told, not dramatic ones, just pieces of life. Benson talking about the factory, Mercy sharing moments from school. David quietly reflected on things he rarely said out loud during the day, and sometimes when the night stretched long and the power went out, as it often did, they would sit in near darkness, lit only by a kerosene lamp. Those were the moments that stayed with Michael the most, not because of what was said, but because of what was felt. Closeness. There was something about that kind of life, where nothing was excessive, where every small thing mattered, that shaped the way Michael saw the world. He understood value early, not just the value of money, but of effort, of time, of trust. Still, even in that grounded life, there were moments when his mind wandered beyond Kirangi. Sometimes it was triggered by the radio, when news from Nairobi or even further would filter through in fragments, stories of business, of politics, of people building things that felt worlds away from the quiet village he knew. Other times it was visitors, relatives from the city, dressed differently, speaking with a certain confidence that hinted at a life Michael had not yet seen. He never said much during those moments, but something in him shifted. He began to ask different questions, not just, what is this, like Samuel would, but what could this become? And more quietly, where do I fit in all this? It wasn't dissatisfaction. He loved his home. He respected the life his parents had built against odds that weren't always visible to outsiders. But there was a growing awareness inside him that the world was larger than Kirangi, and that somehow his path might stretch beyond the red roads he had known all his life. David noticed it first. One evening, as they walked back from the tap, carrying water, David glanced at him and said, almost casually, "You think too much." Michael smiled slightly. "Is that a bad thing?" David shook his head. "No, just don't forget where you started." It wasn't a warning. It was something else. A reminder, maybe. Michael nodded, though he didn't respond immediately. Because in that moment, he understood something quietly, but clearly his life would not be a straight line. It would be shaped by everything around him: his father's discipline, His mother's belief in education, David's steady presence, Faith's emotional strength, Samuel's restless curiosity, Esther's quiet understanding, all of it. And though he didn't yet know how, or when, or what it would look like, there was already a sense, faint but undeniable, that he was being prepared for something more than just survival, something that would require not only hard work, but vision. And that realization didn't come with excitement or fear. It came with responsibility. The sense of responsibility didn't arrive all at once. It grew slowly, almost unnoticed, the way a boy's voice changes before anyone points it out. For Michael, it began showing itself in small things. He started waking up earlier than he needed to, not because anyone asked him to, but because he had begun to understand the rhythm of his father's life. Benson was always the first to rise. Before the sun even hinted at the horizon, there would be the soft creak of the door, the sound of a metal cup placed carefully on the table, and the quiet clearing of his throat as he prepared for another day. At first, Michael would only hear it in his sleep. Then one day he opened his eyes and stayed awake. After that, it became a habit. He would sit up on his thin mattress listening as his father moved about in the dim light, and sometimes, without saying anything, he would get up and join him. There wasn't much conversation in those moments, just presence. Two figures in the half-dark, one already shaped by years of responsibility, the other slowly stepping into it. Benson never praised him for it, but he didn't question it either, and that in its own way meant something. As the months passed, people in the village began to notice Michael differently, not in a loud or obvious way, but in the quiet acknowledgements that matter more than open compliments. A neighbor would call him to help carry something heavy. An older man might ask his opinion on a small matter, half in jest, half in curiosity. Even the shopkeeper at the small kiosk near the road began to trust him to run small errands without supervision. It wasn't that Michael was trying to be responsible. It was simply that he didn't know how not to be. But with that came something else, pressure, though he would not have called it that at the time. Being the second-born placed him in a strange position. He wasn't shielded by the expectations placed on David, nor was he free from them like the younger ones. He stood in between, close enough to leadership to feel its weight, but distant enough to question it. And Michael did question things. He questioned why his father worked so hard and still worried about money at the end of the month. He questioned why some children at school had books that looked new while others shared torn pages. He questioned why effort did not always lead to ease. These weren't questions he voiced often. They stayed in his mind, turning over slowly, shaping the way he looked at the world. One afternoon, those questions found a quiet turning point. It was during the dry season, when the ground cracked slightly underfoot and the air carried a thin layer of dust that seemed to settle on everything. School had ended early that day, and instead of going straight home, Michael found himself walking along the longer path that curved past the Ziwani Trading Center. There, life moved a little faster. Small businesses lined the road, makeshift stalls, metal shops, kiosks selling everything from sugar to soap. Men stood outside talking numbers, negotiating, arguing, laughing. It was different from the stillness of the village homes. There was movement, exchange, energy. Michael slowed down as he passed a small hardware stall. The owner, an older man named Kamau, was busy attending to a customer, explaining the price of nails and sheets of metal. Michael stood a few steps away, pretending to adjust his shoe, but really, he was listening. "It's not just the cost," Kamau was saying. "You have to think about what you'll make from it." The customer hesitated, then nodded slowly. Michael stayed there longer than he needed to, watching, listening, taking in the way numbers turned into decisions and decisions into something tangible. That evening, he returned home quieter than usual. Faith noticed first. She always did. "You're thinking again," she said lightly, sitting beside him as he stared at nothing in particular. Michael gave a small smile. "I'm always thinking." "Yes," she replied, nudging him gently. "But today it's heavier." He didn't answer immediately. Then, after a moment, he said, "Do you ever feel like there's more we're supposed to do, not just live like this forever?" Faith didn't laugh. She didn't brush it off. She looked at him for a second, really looked, then said, "Maybe. But not everyone gets to choose that." Michael nodded slowly. That was the part he was beginning to understand. It wasn't just about wanting more. It was about figuring out how. As he grew older, school became both an escape and a battleground. Subjects like mathematics and business studies began to draw him in more deeply. Numbers made sense in a way life didn't always. They followed rules. They led somewhere clear. And yet, he could also see how those same numbers shaped the lives of people around him. The cost of food, the wages at the factory, the difference between getting by and moving forward. Teachers began to take note. One of them, Mr. Otieno, a man known for being strict but fair, called Michael aside after class one day. "You don't just answer questions," he said, looking at him over his glasses. "You think beyond them." Michael wasn't sure what to say, so he remained quiet. Mr. Otieno continued, "That can take you far, or it can distract you. It depends on how you use it." That stayed with him, because for the first time, someone had put into words something Michael had only felt, that the way he thought could either build something or lead him nowhere if he didn't learn how to focus it. At home, life remained grounded. Benson still worked long hours. Mercy still carried the weight of both her students and her own children's futures. David was beginning to spend more time away, slowly stepping into his own responsibilities beyond the household, and the younger ones continued to grow, each revealing more of who they were becoming. But Michael was changing in a way that was less visible. He had begun to understand that dreams alone were not enough, that wanting something different required more than thought. It required direction, patience, and sometimes sacrifice. And though he still laughed with his siblings, still helped with chores, still walked the same red roads he always had, there was a quiet shift in how he moved through it all, more deliberate, more aware, as if each day was no longer just something to get through, but something to build on. He didn't announce it, he didn't fully understand it himself, but somewhere between the early mornings with his father, the lessons from his mother, the silent observations in the trading center, and the growing questions in his own mind, Michael had crossed an invisible line. He was no longer just a boy shaped by his environment. He was beginning, slowly and carefully, to shape himself. The change didn't come all at once. It never does. For Michael, it showed itself in the way he started noticing time, not just the passing of it, but the weight of it. There were mornings when he would wake before the others, not just his father now, and sit outside on the low stone near the doorway, watching the village come to life. The sky would shift slowly from deep blue to a pale orange, and in that quiet space before the noise began, he found himself thinking about things he couldn't yet explain. Not dreams in the usual sense, not the kind children spoke about easily. He was quieter, more persistent, like something calling him forward, even when he didn't yet know where forward was. By the time the house stirred awake, he would already be moving, fetching water, helping Esther get ready, sometimes even starting the fire before his mother stepped out. Mercy noticed, of course. She noticed everything, but she didn't say much about it. Only once, as she passed behind him one morning, she placed her hand lightly on his shoulder and said, almost to herself, "You're growing faster than time." Michael didn't respond, but he felt it. At school, things began to shift as well. Not in his performance, he had always done well, but in how people treated him. Teachers no longer just saw him as Mercy's son. They began to see him as someone who could carry responsibility beyond himself. He was asked to help organize small activities, to guide younger students, to represent the class in discussions. It wasn't something he asked for, but he didn't turn away from it either. Still, with that came a certain distance. Not from his friends entirely, but from the simplicity they still seemed to live in. While they argued over football teams or laughed over small things, Michael sometimes found himself half present, his mind drifting elsewhere, not out of arrogance, just awareness, the kind that quietly separates you without you intending it to. One afternoon, that distance became clear to him. It was during a break under the old acacia tree behind the classroom. A group of boys were arguing loudly about a match they had played the day before. Samuel would have been right in the middle of it, full of energy, defending his side with endless arguments. Michael sat nearby, listening, smiling faintly, but not joining in. "Why are you always quiet these days?" one of them asked suddenly. Michael shrugged. "I'm not quiet." "You are," the boy insisted. "It's like you're somewhere else." Michael didn't answer immediately, because the truth was, he was. That evening, as he walked home, he took the longer route again, past the trading center, past Kamau's hardware store. This time, he didn't just watch from a distance, he stepped closer. Kamau noticed him almost immediately. "You again," he said, not unkindly. "You like this place too much for someone who doesn't buy anything." Michael smiled slightly. "I'm learning." Kamau raised an eyebrow. "Learning what?" Michael hesitated, then said, "How things move." The older man studied him for a moment, then let out a short laugh. "Things don't just move. People move them. Money moves them. Decisions move them." Michael nodded slowly. "That's what I mean." There was a pause, not uncomfortable, just measuring. "Come tomorrow," Kamau said finally, turning back to his work. "If you want to learn, don't just stand there like a customer with no money." Michael didn't respond right away, but something in his chest shifted again. Not excitement, not fear, something steadier than that, opportunity. The next day he returned, and the day after that. It started small, sweeping the front of the stall, arranging items, watching closely as customers came and went. Kamau wasn't a patient teacher in the traditional sense. He didn't explain things step by step. He spoke in fragments, in passing comments, in corrections that came without warning. "You're giving too much change." Watch how he hesitated before agreeing to the price. "Don't look at the item, look at the person." At first it was overwhelming. There was too much to take in, too many small details that seemed to matter more than the obvious ones. But Michael adapted the way he always had, by observing, by listening, by piecing things together slowly. At home he didn't talk much about it. Not because he was hiding it, but because he didn't yet have the words for what he was learning. Benson noticed the late returns though. "Where have you been?" he asked one evening, not accusing, just direct. "Ziwani Trading Center," Michael replied. "Doing what?" Michael paused. "Watching, helping sometimes." Benson studied him for a second, then nodded. "Just don't forget your responsibilities here." "I won't." And he didn't. If anything, he became more disciplined, more intentional with his time. He began to understand that if he wanted something beyond what was already laid out for him, he would have to carry both worlds at once. The one he came from and the one he was slowly stepping into. Faith saw the change more clearly than anyone. "You're not just thinking anymore," she said one evening as they sat outside, the sky already dark. Michael glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "You're doing something about it." He didn't deny it. "Do you know where it's leading?" she asked. Michael shook his head slightly. "No." Faith smiled softly. "Good. If you did, it would probably mean you're not aiming high enough." He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh. But later that night, lying on his mattress, staring at the ceiling he had known his entire life, he allowed himself to think more honestly than he had before. For the first time, the idea of leaving Kirangi didn't feel distant or abstract. It felt possible, not immediate, not easy, but real in a way it hadn't been before. And with that realization came something heavier than ambition. Responsibility, not just to himself, but to everything that had shaped him. His father's discipline, his mother's quiet sacrifices, David's steady example, Faith's understanding, Samuel's restless curiosity, Esther's silent belief in him. He understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that whatever path he chose next would not belong to him alone. It would carry all of them. And that thought didn't scare him. It grounded him. Because Michael was beginning to understand something. Most people take years to learn that moving forward is not about leaving everything behind. It's about carrying it differently. And as sleep finally came, slowly and without rush, one thing settled firmly in his mind. Not as a dream, but as a quiet decision. He would not let the life he came from limit him. But he would also never allow himself to outgrow it. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm that only Michael seemed to fully understand. From the outside, nothing had really changed. The same early mornings, the same walk to school, the same chores waiting in the evening, the same voices filling the house at night. But inside him, something had shifted in a way that made everything feel sharper, more intentional. He had started to divide his time without calling it that. School was no longer just about passing exams. It became something closer to a tool, something he could use if he understood it well enough. He listened differently in class now, not just to answer questions, but to see how ideas connected to the real world. He was beginning to observe at the trading center. And the trading center, Kamal's stall in particular, had quietly become his second classroom. At first, he only came in the afternoons, after school, and before heading home. But as days passed, he began showing up earlier when he could, sometimes even on weekends when most boys his age were out playing or wandering through the village without much thought. Kamal never praised him, not once, but he stopped treating him like a boy who was just passing time. One Saturday morning, before the sun had fully risen, Michael found Kamal already opening the stall. The man glanced at him briefly, then handed him a small notebook without explanation. "Write everything you see today," he said. Michael frowned slightly. "Everything?" "Everything that matters," Kamal corrected, already turning away to arrange a stack of metal rods. At first, it felt strange. What mattered were prices, people, conversations. So he wrote more than he needed to. He wrote down how many customers came before midday. He noted the items they asked for, the ones they hesitated over, the ones they left behind. He wrote the prices Kamal mentioned, and the slightly different ones he sometimes accepted after a pause. By midday, his hand was tired and his notes were messy, but something else had happened. He had started seeing patterns, the same type of customer asking the same kind of questions, the same hesitation before agreeing to a price, the same quick decisions from those who seemed to know exactly what they wanted. When he handed the notebook back, Kamal flipped through it slowly, his face unreadable. "You wrote too much," he said finally. Michael felt a small drop in his chest. "I thought." "But you saw something," Kamal interrupted. He tapped a page lightly. "Next time, write less, but see more." That stayed with Michael longer than any lesson he had received in school that week. At home, life carried on in its steady, familiar way, but even there, the small changes in him were becoming harder to miss. David had started coming home later than usual, sometimes quiet in a way that suggested his mind was elsewhere. Responsibility was pulling him further out, just as it had begun to do with Michael, but in a different direction. One evening, as they sat outside after supper, David broke the silence first. "You've been going to that place a lot," he said, not looking at him. Michael nodded. "Yes. What are you getting from it?" The question wasn't challenging, it was honest. Michael took a moment before answering. "Understanding." David let out a small breath, almost like a laugh. "That's a big word." Michael shrugged slightly. "It feels like a big thing." There was a pause. "Just don't lose yourself trying to chase things you don't fully know yet," David said quietly. Michael looked at him then. "Did you?" David didn't answer immediately. His eyes stayed fixed ahead, somewhere beyond the dim light of the compound. "Sometimes," he admitted. That was all he said, but it was enough. It was the first time Michael understood that even the people he looked up to were still figuring things out as they went. That realization didn't weaken his respect for David. If anything, it made it more real. At school, the pressure began to build in a different way. Exams were approaching, and with them came expectations. Not just from his mother, but from teachers who had begun to quietly place him in a category of students to watch. Mr. Otieno called him aside again one afternoon. "You're dividing your attention," he said plainly. Michael didn't deny it. "Be careful," the teacher continued. "Potential is easy to waste when you try to carry too many things at once." Michael nodded, but inside he felt a quiet resistance, because what Mr. Otieno didn't see that these many things were beginning to connect. Mathematics wasn't just numbers anymore. It was the way Kamau calculated profit without writing anything down. It was the way prices shifted depending on supply and demand, even if no one used those exact words. Business studies wasn't just theory, it was happening in front of him every afternoon. And life at home, responsibility, discipline, patience, that was shaping how he approached all of it. Still, he understood the warning. So he adjusted. He began studying later into the night, sometimes under the dim light of the kerosene lamp when power was out, long after the others had gone to sleep. It wasn't forced, it was necessary. There were nights when exhaustion crept in, when his eyes struggled to stay open, when the weight of everything he was trying to balance pressed down on him quietly. But he didn't stop, because somewhere along the way, effort had stopped feeling like something imposed on him. It had become something he chose. Faith noticed the change in a different way. "You don't laugh as easily anymore," she said one evening, half teasing, half serious. Michael looked at her, surprised. "I do." She shook her head lightly. "You smile. That's different." He didn't argue, because he knew she was right. It wasn't that he was unhappy, far from it. He just felt focused. Even Samuel, who rarely paid attention to anything that didn't immediately interest him, started asking questions. "Why do you go there every day?" he asked one afternoon, watching Michael prepare to leave. Michael glanced at him. "Because I want to understand how things work." Samuel grinned. "I already know how things work." Michael raised an eyebrow. "Do you?" "Yes," Samuel said confidently. "You open them, you look inside, then you fix them." Michael laughed softly. "That's one way," he said, "but not the only way." And in that moment, he saw clearly how different their paths might become, even though they started in the same place. As the dry season deepened, the village took on a slightly harsher tone. The air was drier, the ground was harder, even the days felt longer. At the trading center, business picked up in certain ways. Repairs became more frequent. People fixed what they had instead of replacing it. Money moved differently, more carefully. Michael noticed all of it. One afternoon, Kamau stepped away briefly, leaving him alone at the stall. It wasn't a test that was announced, but it felt like one. A customer approached, asking for a specific size of nails. Michael found them quickly, just as he had seen Kamau do many times. The man asked for the price. For a second, Michael hesitated. Then he answered. The man nodded, paid, and left without question. When Kamau returned, Michael mentioned it, almost casually. Kamau didn't react immediately. He just asked. Did he hesitate? Michael thought back. No. Then you priced it right. That was it. No praise, no correction. But Michael felt something settle inside him. Not pride, not exactly. Confidence. The kind that doesn't come from being told you're capable, but from seeing it for yourself. That evening, as he walked home, the sky stretched wide above him, painted in fading shades of orange and grey. The road was the same dusty path he had walked his entire life, but it didn't feel the same, because now, when he looked ahead, he didn't just see where the road ended. He saw where it could lead, and for the first time, he didn't feel like he was just following a path laid out before him. He felt like slowly, step by step, he was beginning to choose it. The first real test didn't come the way Michael expected. There was no announcement, no moment where someone told him, this is where things change. It came quietly, the way most important things in his life had, through circumstance, through timing, through a small decision that carried more weight than it first appeared. It started with Benson. For days, his father had been moving a little slower than usual. Not enough for anyone to question it at first, but enough for Michael to notice. The early mornings were still there, the routine unchanged, but there was a heaviness in the way he stood, in the way he stretched his back before stepping out. Michael didn't say anything. He just watched. Then one morning, Benson didn't wake up before him. That alone was enough to feel wrong. Michael sat up, listening. The house was too quiet for that hour. No soft footsteps, no kettle being placed on the stove, no quiet clearing of the throat. He stood up and stepped into the main room. Benson was seated on the wooden chair, one hand pressed against his side, His face tightened in a way Michael had never seen before. "I'm fine," Benson said before Michael could even ask. But Michael had already learned something his father had never said out loud. Being fine and saying "you're fine" were not always the same thing. "Are you going to work?" Michael asked. Benson hesitated just for a second. "I'll see." That hesitation said everything. By midday it was clear he wasn't going anywhere. Mercy stayed home from school that day, something she rarely did. The house, usually full of movement and small conversations, felt still in a different way. Even Samuel kept his questions to himself. Faith moved quietly between rooms. Esther stayed close to the doorway, watching everything without speaking. Michael found himself outside more than inside. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know where to place himself at that moment. For the first time, the steady foundation he had always relied on felt uncertain. That evening, as the light faded and the air cooled, Mercy stepped outside where Michael was sitting. "We'll need to manage for a few days," she said simply. Michael nodded. "How bad is it?" "She thinks it's a strain," Mercy replied. "He's been pushing himself too hard." Michael looked down at his hands. They were rougher now than they had been a year ago, marked by small cuts and calluses from work he had taken on without thinking much about it. "What needs to be done?" he asked. Mercy looked at him carefully, as if measuring something she had always known was there, but had never fully called upon. "Everything," she said, and that was how it began. The next morning, Michael woke earlier than ever before, not to observe, not to ease into the day, but because there was no one else to fill the space his father usually occupied. He stepped into the role without ceremony. Water had to be fetched, fire had to be lit. The younger ones had to prepare for school. Mercy had to leave early to make up for the time she had already missed. David helped where he could, but his responsibilities outside the home had already begun to stretch him thin. He wasn't absent, just pulled in more directions than before. So Michael carried what remained. At first, it felt like an extension of what he had already been doing. But it didn't take long for him to realize the difference between helping and being depended on. Helping was optional. This wasn't. After school, instead of going straight to the trading center, he came home first. There were things that couldn't wait. Meals to prepare, errands to run, small decisions that had to be made without delay. By the time he reached Kamal's stall, the day was already half gone. Kamal noticed immediately. "You're late," he said, not looking up. Michael nodded. "Things at home." Kamal didn't ask further. "Then don't waste the time you have." Michael worked with a different kind of focus that day. Not the quiet curiosity he had before, but something sharper, more urgent. Because now, what he was learning wasn't just about understanding anymore. It was about use. Over the next few days, the pattern held. School, home, responsibilities. Then the stall, if time allowed. There were moments when it felt like too much, not in a dramatic way, just in the quiet accumulation of small tasks that never really ended, the kind that followed each other without pause. One evening, as he sat outside after everyone had gone to sleep, he felt it fully for the first time. Not frustration, weight, the kind that settles on your shoulders without asking and stays there whether you're ready or not. Faith came out and sat beside him without saying anything. "You're tired," she said after a while. Michael let out a slow breath. "It's fine." She shook her head slightly. "You say that like Dad." Michael glanced at her, a faint smile forming despite himself. "Maybe I understand him a bit more now." Faith looked at him, her expression softer than usual. "You don't have to carry everything alone." Michael didn't respond right away, because the truth was he didn't feel alone. He just felt responsible. "There are things that need to be done," he said finally. Faith nodded. "I know. Just don't forget, you're not the only one who can do them." That stayed with him. Not as a correction, but as a reminder. The next day, he did something small but important. He asked for help. Samuel took over part of the water runs, though he complained at first. Esther helped with simple tasks around the house. Faith stepped in more deliberately where emotional balance was needed, keeping things from feeling heavier than they already were. And slowly, the weight shifted. Not gone, just shared. At the trading center, Kamal began giving him more responsibility without saying it directly. He left him to handle small transactions more often, asked him for quick opinions. He watched how he responded under pressure. One afternoon, during a particularly busy hour, Michael found himself managing 3 customers at once. Different needs, different expectations, different levels of patience. For a moment, it felt like too much. Then something clicked, not perfectly, not smoothly, but enough. He moved between them, answered questions, adjusted, and made small decisions quickly. Not all of them were perfect, but they worked. When it slowed down, Kamau glanced at him briefly. "You're learning faster now," he said. Michael wiped his hands on a cloth. "I have to." Kamau nodded once. That's usually when people do. Back at home, Benson was beginning to recover slowly, though he still moved carefully, like someone aware that pushing too far too soon could set him back. One evening, he called Michael to sit beside him. "You've been doing a lot," he said. Michael shrugged slightly. It needed to be done. Benson studied him, the way he always did, quietly, without rushing to speak. "Don't confuse doing what's needed with carrying what isn't yours," he said. Michael frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "There's a difference," Benson replied. "You'll learn it." Michael nodded, though he didn't fully understand yet, but he would, because over the next few days, as things slowly returned to normal, he began to see it. The house didn't fall apart when he stepped back slightly. Responsibilities adjusted, people adapted, and in that, he understood something important. Strength wasn't just about how much you could carry, it was about knowing what to carry and what to let move around you without holding it all yourself. By the time Benson returned to work, things had changed in a way no one said out loud. Michael wasn't just helping anymore. He had stepped into something deeper, not fully a man, not fully a boy, but somewhere in between, where decisions begin to matter more than intentions. And as he walked back to the trading center that evening, the dust rising slightly under his steps, he realized something quietly but clearly. Life wasn't waiting for him to be ready. It had already started asking more of him, and without realizing it, he had already begun answering. Benson's return to work should have brought everything back to how it was before. At least, that's what everyone expected. And in some ways, it did. The early mornings resumed. The quiet clatter of a metal cup, the low hum of the radio in the evening, the steady rhythm of a man who had always carried more than he said. Life, from the outside, slipped back into its familiar shape. But inside the house, and inside Michael, something had changed in a way that couldn't simply return to what it was. Responsibility, once felt, doesn't disappear. It settles. It stays. Michael didn't step back into being just another child in the house. Even when there was less to do, he still woke early, still checked on things without being asked, still moved with that same quiet awareness, as if he had seen something he couldn't unsee. Benson noticed it, though he didn't speak on it directly. Instead, he began doing something different. He started taking Michael with him more often, not just for the occasional side job like before, but regularly, especially on weekends. Small repairs at first, welding broken gates, fixing hinges that had given up after years of use, jobs that didn't pay much but mattered to the people who needed them. The first time it happened after his recovery, Benson simply said, "Come with me." No explanation, no discussion. Michael followed. They walked a longer distance than usual that morning, past the familiar parts of Kirangi and into a neighboring area where homes were spaced further apart, some slightly better built, some showing signs of people who had managed to move a step ahead. At the job site, Benson didn't give instructions right away. He just started working. Michael stood close, watching the same way he always had, but this time, something felt different. Benson wasn't just working in front of him, he was working with him in mind. After a while, he handed Michael a tool. "Hold this steady." It was a simple task, but the way he said it made it clear it mattered. Michael adjusted his grip, focusing carefully as Benson worked around him. The heat, the sparks, the smell of metal, it was all familiar, but now he was part of it in a more direct way. "Not like that," Benson said calmly. "Firm, but not stiff. Let it move a little." Michael corrected himself. "Good." That one word stayed with him longer than any praise he had received before, because Benson didn't give it lightly. They worked like that for hours, Minimal conversation, just small corrections, short instructions, and long stretches of shared focus. On the walk back, Benson finally spoke. "You don't rush the work like this," he said. "If you rush, you fix it twice, or someone gets hurt." Michael nodded. "I've seen that." Benson glanced at him briefly. Seeing and understanding are not the same. Michael didn't argue, because he knew it was true. That evening, he went to the trading center later than usual. Kamal was already closing up when he arrived. "You're late again," he said. Michael exhaled slightly. "I was working with my father." Kamal paused for a second, then nodded once. "Good." There was something in the way he said it, not dismissive, not overly approving, just acknowledging. "You'll need both," Kamal added. Michael looked at him. "Both?" "Hands and mind," Kamal said, locking the stall. "People who only use one rarely go far." They stood there for a moment in the fading light. Then Kamal added, almost as an afterthought, "Come earlier tomorrow." Michael frowned slightly. "I have school." Kamal shook his head. "Not morning, evening, before the rush." Michael nodded. "All right." The next day, he adjusted. And that adjustment began to show him something new. The trading center wasn't the same at every hour. In the early evening, before it got crowded, there was a different kind of movement. People came with clearer intentions, fewer distractions, more direct conversations. Kamal used that time differently too. He talked more, not in long lectures, but in pieces, stories, observations, small explanations that seemed simple until Michael thought about them later. "You see that man?" Kamal said one evening, nodding toward a customer who had just left. "He asked for a lower price, but he was always going to buy." "How do you know?" Michael asked. "He didn't look at any alternatives," Kamal replied. "He only wanted to feel like he negotiated." Michael absorbed that quietly. Another time, Kamal pointed out a woman who walked away without buying anything. "She'll come back," he said. "Why?" Michael asked. "She asked the right questions, just not ready yet." These weren't things written in any book Michael had read, but they made sense in a way that stayed with him. At school, the pressure continued to build, but now it felt different. Not like something pushing against him, but something he was learning to balance. Mr. Otieno watched him more closely than before. One afternoon, after returning a test paper, he stopped by Michael's desk. "You've improved," he said. Michael looked up, slightly surprised. "Thank you. But your focus is divided," the teacher continued. Michael didn't respond immediately. Mr. Otieno leaned slightly closer. "Just make sure you're choosing your distractions wisely." Michael almost smiled at that, because for the first time he didn't see what he was doing as a distraction. He saw it as preparation. At home, the dynamic had shifted in quieter ways. David had begun to speak to him differently, not as a younger brother who needed guidance, but as someone who could understand things without having them explained fully. One night, as they sat together after supper, David said, "If you leave here one day, what would you go for?" It wasn't a casual question. Michael thought about it longer than expected. "Not just money," he said finally. David nodded. "Good. I want to understand how things grow," Michael continued. "Not just survive." David looked at him, really looked, and for a moment, there was something like recognition in his expression. "Then don't rush it," he said quietly. "Growth takes time. People who try to skip that part usually fall back harder." Michael nodded, because deep down he already knew there were no shortcuts where he was trying to go. Even Samuel, in his own way, began to shift slightly. His curiosity didn't disappear, but it started turning toward Michael more often. "Show me something," he said one afternoon. "Like what?" Michael asked. "Something real," Samuel replied. "Not school things." So Michael took him to the trading center, not to work, just to watch. At first, Samuel was restless, looking around, picking at things, asking too many questions too quickly. But then, slowly, he settled. He started noticing. Not everything, but enough. "Why did that man leave?" Samuel asked at one point. Michael glanced at him. "What do you think?" Samuel frowned, thinking. "Maybe he didn't have enough money?" Michael nodded slightly. "Or maybe he wasn't sure it was worth it." Samuel looked back toward the road. his expression shifting just a little. That was how it began, not as a lesson, but as a shared moment of understanding. As the days turned into weeks, Michael found himself standing in a space he hadn't fully recognized before. He wasn't just learning anymore, he was connecting things. The discipline from his father, the quiet strength from his mother, the awareness from his siblings, the lessons from Kamau, the structure from school. They were no longer separate pieces. They were becoming something whole. One evening, as he walked home alone, the sky stretching wide and dark above him, he slowed down without realizing it. The road was empty, the air was still. For a moment, everything felt quiet in a way that allowed his thoughts to settle clearly. He thought about where he had started, the small house, the early mornings, the expectations, the questions that had once felt too big to answer. And then he thought about where he was now, not far, not yet, but not the same either. He wasn't chasing something undefined anymore. He was building something, slowly, carefully, step by step. And for the first time, he understood that progress didn't always look like movement. Sometimes it looked like staying in place and growing from it. Michael adjusted his path slightly and kept walking, not faster, just steadier. Because now, more than ever, he knew he wasn't just preparing for life ahead. He was already living it. It was around that time that Michael began to notice something else, something quieter than responsibility, but just as heavy: expectation. Not the kind his mother spoke about in simple words, or the kind that came from teachers and exams. This one was different. It came without being announced. It showed itself in how people looked at him now, how they spoke to him, what they assumed he would become. At first, he didn't pay much attention to it, but then small moments began to add up. A neighbor stopping him on the path and saying, "You're the one who will change things in that family." An older man at the trading center asked his opinion on prices as if it actually carried weight. Even the shopkeeper who once sent him on errands now trusted him with things that involved money without counting twice. None of it was loud, but it stayed with him, and the more it stayed, the more he began to feel the space between who he was and who people were starting to believe he could be. One evening, that weight followed him home more clearly than before. The family had gathered for supper, the usual meal laid out simply. Conversation moved the way it always did, Samuel talking more than anyone else, Faith keeping things light, Esther listening quietly, Benson speaking only when necessary, Mercy occasionally correcting or guiding without raising her voice. It should have felt normal, but Michael found himself quieter than usual. Mercy noticed first. "You didn't say anything today," she said, not as a question, but an observation. Michael looked up slightly. "I'm just tired." Benson glanced at him, but said nothing. Faith studied him for a moment longer than usual, but let it pass. The conversation continued, but Michael's mind stayed elsewhere. Later that night, after everyone had gone to sleep, he stepped outside. The air was cooler, carrying that familiar stillness that only came when the village had settled completely. No voices, no movement, just the quiet hum of the night. He sat on the same stone he had sat on so many mornings before. But this time, he wasn't watching the day begin. He was trying to understand something that didn't have a clear shape, thinking again. Faith's voice came from behind him. He didn't turn, always. She walked over and sat beside him, pulling her knees slightly closer as she settled. "What is it this time?" she asked. Michael hesitated, then spoke more honestly than he had before. "Do you ever feel like people are already deciding who you're supposed to be before you get there?" Faith didn't answer immediately. She looked ahead, the same way he was, letting the question sit between them. "Sometimes," she said finally, "but I think people do that because it's easier than not knowing." Michael frowned slightly. "Easier for who?" "For them," she replied. "Not for you." That made him exhale quietly. "I don't even know if I can be what they think," he said. Faith turned to look at him then. "Since when did you start trying to become what people think?" Michael didn't respond. Because the truth was, he hadn't. But the expectation was there anyway, and it was beginning to press on him in ways he hadn't fully admitted. "You've changed," Faith said gently. "That's true. everyone can see it. But that doesn't mean you owe them a version of yourself you haven't even figured out yet. Michael looked at her briefly. You make it sound simple. It's not, she said, almost smiling. That's why most people don't figure it out. They sat in silence after that. Not uncomfortable, just real. The next day, Michael carried that conversation with him, not as an answer but as something to hold on to. At the trading center, the day unfolded like any other, but his attention felt sharper, more deliberate. Kamau noticed it almost immediately. You're somewhere else today, he said, arranging items without looking up. Michael leaned against the wooden frame of the stall. I've been thinking. Kamau let out a small, knowing breath. That's your problem. Michael almost smiled. It's also what helps me. Kamau nodded once. True, but thinking too much without deciding anything can slow you down. Michael folded his arms slightly. How do you know when to decide? Kamau paused, then looked at him properly for the first time that day. You don't, he said. You just reach a point where not deciding becomes more uncomfortable than choosing wrong. Michael absorbed that quietly, because it made sense in a way that felt practical. Not perfect, but real. That afternoon, something happened that stayed with him longer than expected. A man came to the stall, clearly frustrated. He needed materials for a repair, but didn't have enough money for everything at once. His voice carried that edge, part urgency, part pride. Kamau handled it the way he always did, calm, direct. No unnecessary sympathy, but no harshness either. Take what you can manage today, he said. Come back for the rest. The man hesitated. What if the price changes? Kamau shrugged slightly. Then it changes. There was a pause. Then Kamau added, or you decide it matters enough to come back before it does. The man stood there for a moment, then nodded slowly. He bought part of what he needed and left. Michael watched the entire exchange without speaking. After a while, he said, you could have lowered the price. Kamau glanced at him. Yes. But you didn't. No. Why? Kamau picked up a piece of metal, turning it slightly in his hand. Because not every problem is solved by making things easier, he said. Sometimes people need to feel the weight of their decisions. That's how they take them seriously. Michael didn't respond immediately, because that didn't just apply to business. It applied to everything. That evening, as he walked home, he took a different route without thinking about it. One that passed by a slightly elevated part of the village, where you could see more of Kirangi spread out below. Small homes, narrow paths, faint lights beginning to appear as dusk settled in. He stopped there, not for long, just enough to look. And in that moment, something settled inside him. Not a conclusion, not a plan, but a clearer sense of where he stood. He wasn't just a boy from that village anymore, but he wasn't beyond it either. He was in between. And maybe that wasn't something to rush out of. Maybe it was something to understand fully before moving on. When he got home, Benson was sitting outside, the radio beside him, tuned low. Michael sat down nearby without saying anything. After a while, Benson spoke. You've been carrying your thoughts heavily these days. Michael looked at him, slightly surprised. Is it that obvious? Benson nodded once, to someone who has done the same. There was a pause. Does it go away? Michael asked. Benson shook his head. No. Michael exhaled slowly. But you learn which ones to carry, Benson added, and which ones to leave where they are. Michael looked down, then back up again. How do you know the difference? Benson leaned back slightly, his eyes on the darkening sky. You don't always know, he said, but life will show you, if you pay attention. Michael nodded. And for once, that was enough. Because more and more he was beginning to understand that not everything needed an immediate answer. Some things needed time. And he was learning, slowly, steadily, how to give it. The days didn't slow down after that conversation. If anything, they seemed to move faster, like something had quietly shifted and time was now trying to catch up. Michael stopped fighting that feeling. Instead, he leaned into it. He began paying attention to things he would have ignored before, not just at the trading center or at school, but everywhere. The way his mother managed money without ever making it obvious. The way his father chose which jobs to accept and which ones to turn down, even when they needed the income. The way David had started speaking less, but doing more. Even the way Faith read a room before saying anything at all. It was like pieces were coming together, not in a straight line, but in a way that made sense if you stepped back far enough. One Sunday afternoon, something small turned into something bigger than it looked. Benson had been called to fix a broken gate for a man who lived a bit further out, near the edge of where Kirangi began to thin into open land. The kind of place where homes were fewer, but each one stood on a little more ground than usual. This time, he didn't just ask Michael to come, he said, "You'll handle part of it." Michael didn't ask what that meant, he just nodded. When they arrived, the gate was worse than expected. One hinge completely broken, the frame slightly bent, the metal weakened from years of exposure. It wasn't a quick job. Benson studied it for a while, then turned to Michael. "You see the problem?" he asked. Michael stepped closer, running his hand lightly along the metal, looking where the strain had built over time. "It wasn't fixed properly before," he said slowly. "They just patched it." Benson nodded. "And now?" Michael looked again more carefully. "If we just fix the hinge, it will break again." "Exactly." There was a pause. Then Benson handed him a tool. "Start there," he said, pointing to a section of the frame. "Straighten it." Michael felt it immediately. The difference between being told what to do and being trusted to decide how to do it. He took a breath, then began. It wasn't smooth at first. The metal resisted. His grip adjusted more than once. He had to step back, look again, and try a different angle. At one point, he almost forced it too quickly, but Benson's voice cut in quietly. "Don't rush it." Michael slowed down. He worked more carefully after that, paying attention to how the metal responded, not just what he wanted it to do. Time passed without him noticing. By the time Benson stepped in to continue, the frame had shifted enough to make the rest of the work possible. He didn't say anything immediately, but when they were packing up, he glanced at Michael and said, "You're starting to see things properly." It wasn't praise, it was recognition, and for Michael, that meant more. On the walk back, they didn't talk much, but the silence wasn't empty. It carried something new, something closer to respect. That evening, Michael went to the trading center later than planned. The place was already busy, voices overlapping, movement constant. Kamau was in the middle of a negotiation when Michael arrived. He stepped in without being told, taking over smaller tasks, managing what he could. At one point, a customer came in asking for a specific tool, one they didn't have in stock. Michael hesitated. Then he did something he hadn't done before. "There's a place 2 stalls down," he said. "They might have it." The customer looked at him. "Why send me there?" Michael shrugged slightly. "Because we don't have it." The man studied him for a second, then nodded and left. When things settled down, Kamau turned to him. "You just sent a customer away." Michael nodded. "We couldn't help him." Kamau held his gaze for a moment. Then slowly he said, "Good." Michael blinked slightly, surprised. "If you try to hold everything, you lose trust," Kamau continued. "People come back to the place that tells them the truth." That stayed with Michael longer than he expected, because it wasn't just about business. It was about something deeper, something he had seen in his father, in his mother, even in the way Faith spoke to people. Honesty wasn't always easy, but it lasted. A few days later, school brought its own kind of test. Results were being announced, important ones this time, the kind that teachers paid attention to, the kind that started shaping how students were seen going forward. Michael sat in class, waiting without showing it. When his name was called, he stood up calmly and walked to the front. Mr. Otieno handed him the paper without much expression. "Consistent," he said. Michael nodded and returned to his seat. But when he looked down, he saw it clearly. He had done well. Not perfect, but strong. Strong enough to confirm something he had been quietly working towards, that he could carry both worlds without dropping one. At break time, a few students gathered around him. "You always get this," one of them said, half impressed, half frustrated. Michael shook his head slightly. "Not always. But it looks like it," another added. He didn't argue because he knew what they didn't see. The late nights, the divided time, the constant adjustments, success, from the outside, always looked simpler than it was. That evening, he didn't go straight home. He walked again to that higher part of the village where the land opened up and you could see further than usual. He stood there longer this time, watching, thinking, but not the same way he used to. Before, his thoughts had been questions. Now they were beginning to take shape as decisions, small ones still forming, but real. He thought about school, not just finishing it, but using it. He thought about the trading center, not just as a place to learn, but as a starting point. He thought about his family, not just as people he belonged to, but as people he would one day need to support in a bigger way. And for the first time, the idea of leaving Kirangi didn't feel like something distant or uncertain. It felt like something that would happen, not immediately, but eventually. When he got home, he found David sitting alone, unusually early. "You disappeared," David said, not looking up. Michael shrugged. "Just walking." David nodded, then after a moment asked, "Still thinking too much?" Michael smiled slightly. "A little less now." David glanced at him then. "That means you've started deciding." Michael didn't respond, but his silence said enough. Later that night, as he lay down, the house quiet around him, he didn't feel the same weight he had before. Not because things were easier, but because they were clearer. He still didn't know exactly where he was going, but he knew he wasn't standing still anymore. And somewhere in that quiet space between where he had been and where he was heading, Michael understood something simple but steady. Life wasn't waiting to show him the way. It was watching to see if he would choose one. The next shift in Michael's life didn't come from something big. No sudden opportunity, no dramatic moments. It came quietly through something most people would have overlooked, a conversation that didn't seem important at the time. It happened at the trading center on an ordinary afternoon that felt no different from any other. The air was dry, carrying dust that settled on everything, clothes, metal, even the inside of your mouth if you stayed long enough. Business was slow that day, the kind of slowness that made time stretch. Kamal was seated on his usual stool, flipping through a small stack of receipts, while Michael leaned against the wooden frame, watching the road more than the stall. That's when the man arrived. He wasn't from Kirangi. That was obvious immediately, not just from the way he dressed, but from how he carried himself. There was a certain pace to him, not rushed, but intentional, like someone used to moving through places without needing to stop and explain himself. He greeted Kamau briefly, then started asking about bulk materials, metal sheets, hinges, tools, not small purchases, the kind that suggested something bigger. Michael didn't interrupt, he just listened. The man asked precise questions, not just prices, but availability, delivery, timelines. He was thinking ahead, not just buying for the moment. Kamau answered calmly, but there were limits to what he could provide. "We don't keep that kind of volume here," he said. "Not regularly." The man nodded, as if he expected that. "I figured," he replied. "Most places here operate the same way." There was no disrespect in his tone, just observation. Michael felt something in that moment, a small shift in how he was seeing things again. Most places here operate the same way. It wasn't said as a complaint, it was said like a fact. And facts, Michael was learning, always pointed to something deeper. Before leaving, the man turned slightly toward Michael. "You work here?" he asked. Michael shook his head. "I help." The man studied him for a second, then nodded once. "Keep watching," he said. "Places like this teach you what's missing." Then he left, just like that. No name, no long conversation, but the words stayed. That evening, Michael didn't move the same way he usually did. His eyes followed things differently. The small stall, the limited stock, the way customers sometimes walked away when what they needed wasn't available. It wasn't new. He had seen all of it before, but now he was seeing it from another angle. Not just as a place to learn from, but as something with limits. And for the first time, he started asking a different kind of question. What exists beyond this? When he got home, he was quieter than usual. Not heavy like before. Just focused in a deeper way. During supper, Benson noticed. "You've gone somewhere again," he said. Michael looked up slightly. "Not far." Benson nodded. Far doesn't always mean distance. Michael almost smiled at that. After the meal, he stepped outside, but this time he didn't sit. He walked. Not to the usual spot, not to the higher ground, just along the road, letting his thoughts settle into something clearer. By the time he came back, he had made a decision. Not a big one, but a direction. The next day, he went to the trading center earlier than usual. Kamau was still setting up. "I need to ask you something," Michael said. Kamau glanced at him. "That's new." Michael didn't smile. "Where do people go when they need more than this?" Kamau paused slightly, then continued arranging his items. "Depends," he said. "More of what? Materials, options, bigger work." Kamau looked at him properly then. "You're thinking ahead." Michael nodded. "I need to understand." Kamau wiped his hands on a cloth. "You go to town," he said. "Bigger markets, bigger suppliers, places where things move differently." Michael absorbed that. "Have you been?" he asked. Kamau shook his head. "Not in a long time." "Why?" Kamau gave a small shrug. "This is enough for me." There was no regret in his voice, just acceptance. Michael nodded slowly. But inside, he knew something clearly. It wouldn't be enough for him. That realization didn't come with guilt. It came with clarity. At school, his focus sharpened again, but now with a clearer purpose. He wasn't just studying to do well anymore. He was studying because he could see where knowledge might take him. Even Mr. Otieno noticed the shift. "You've settled your mind," he said one afternoon. Michael didn't explain how. He just nodded. At home, things continued as they always did, but Michael began managing his time differently. More intentionally, less wandering, more planning. He started saving small amounts of money, coins here and there from small tasks, errands, anything he could manage without drawing too much attention to it. Not for something immediate, but for something he hadn't yet fully defined. David noticed, of course. "You're preparing for something," he said one evening. Michael didn't deny it. "I don't know what yet," he replied, "but I don't want to be unready when it comes." David nodded slowly. "That's a good way to think," he said. "Just don't forget, some opportunities don't announce themselves." Michael looked at him. "Then I'll have to recognize them when they show up." David gave a faint smile. Exactly. A few days later, something small confirmed that Michael was already changing. A young boy came to the stall, sent by his mother to buy a specific item. He didn't have enough money. Not quite. He stood there, uncertain, shifting his weight, clearly not sure what to do. Michael looked at the item and looked at the boy. Then he made a quick decision. "Take it," he said. "Bring the rest later." The boy hesitated. "But it's fine," Michael said. "Just come back." The boy nodded quickly and left. When Kamau returned, Michael explained. There was a short silence. Then Kamau said, "You just took a risk." Michael nodded. "I know. And if he doesn't come back?" Michael shrugged slightly. "Then I will learn something." Kamau watched him for a moment. Then slowly he nodded. "That's how it starts," he said. Michael didn't ask what he meant, because he understood. It wasn't about the money. It was about judgment, trust, decision. That evening as he walked home, the road didn't feel like something he had to follow anymore. It felt like something he was moving through. And for the first time, the idea of leaving Kirangi wasn't just a distant thought. It was becoming a plan, not complete, not rushed, but real enough to begin shaping his actions. When he reached home, the lights were low, the familiar sounds settling into the night. Everything looked the same, but he knew he wasn't. The idea didn't leave him after that. If anything, it settled deeper. Michael began to notice how often people in Kirangi spoke about the town like it was a different world. Not just a place, but something distant, something you went to only when necessary, not something you built a future around. It showed in the way they talked about prices, opportunities, even people who had left and come back differently. He had heard it all his life, but now it sounded different. Not like a boundary, more like a line people had chosen not to cross. He didn't speak about it immediately, not to his parents, not even to David. Instead, he carried it quietly, testing the idea against everything he already knew. At the trading center, he paid closer attention to the customers who came from outside. They were easy to notice, not because they stood out loudly, but because they asked different questions. They didn't just buy what was available. They compared, they calculated, they thought ahead. And slowly Michael began doing the same, not just in business, in life. One late afternoon, Kamau closed the stall earlier than usual. "Come," he said, picking up his keys. Michael followed without asking where. They walked past the usual stretch of shops, then further, toward a section of the trading center Michael rarely paid attention to. It wasn't as busy, not as loud. A few larger storage structures stood there, some locked, some half open. Kamau stopped in front of one of them. "This is where things wait before they move," he said. Michael looked around, taking it in. Stacks of materials, larger quantities than he had seen at the stall, items not meant for quick, small sales. "Why don't you work from here?" Michael asked. Kamau shook his head. "Different kinds of business. How?" Kamau glanced at him. "Here you don't just sell, you manage flow, supply, timing, money you don't always see immediately." Michael stepped closer to one of the stacks, running his fingers lightly along the edge of a metal sheet. "And that's better?" he asked. Kamau shrugged slightly. "Depends on the person." There was a pause. Then Kamau added, "Some people are comfortable knowing what they'll earn by the end of the day." He nodded back toward the direction of the smaller stalls. "Others are willing to wait longer and risk more." Michael didn't say anything, but inside something settled again. Not excitement, not fear, just recognition. On the way back, Kamau didn't explain further. He didn't need to. Michael had seen enough. That night, sleep didn't come easily, not because his mind was restless in the usual way, but because it was clear, too clear. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling into silence. His father's quiet breathing, the occasional shift from one of his siblings, the distant bark of a dog somewhere beyond the compound. Everything that had always grounded him was still there, but now it felt like the starting point of something, not the whole story. He turned slightly, resting on his side. For the first time, he allowed the thought to form fully. "I will leave here, not in rebellion, not in dissatisfaction, but on purpose." The next morning, he woke before everyone else again. But this time, he didn't sit outside. He went straight to work. Everything he did that day felt more deliberate. Every task had a sense of direction behind it. Even at school, his focus sharpened, not just to perform well, but to build something he could carry with him beyond the classroom. After classes, instead of going straight to the trading center, he went home first. Mercy was seated at the table, marking books as usual, her tea untouched beside her. "Sit," she said without looking up. Michael sat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mercy set her pen down. "You've been thinking about something for a while," she said. It wasn't a question. Michael nodded slowly. "I want to go to town," he said. The words hung there for a moment, not heavy, just real. Mercy didn't react immediately. She leaned back slightly, studying him the same way she had when he was younger, like she was trying to see not just what he was saying, but where it was coming from. "For what?" she asked calmly. "To learn more," Michael replied. "To see how things work beyond here." Mercy's eyes didn't leave him, and here is not enough. Michael hesitated, then chose his words carefully. "It's a start," he said, "but not everything." There was a long pause, not tense, just careful. Mercy looked down briefly, then back at him. "You're not wrong," she said quietly. Michael felt something in his chest ease slightly. "But timing matters," she continued. "Leaving without a plan is not ambition. It's an escape." "I'm not trying to escape," Michael said. "I know," she replied. Another pause. "Then you prepare," she said finally. "You finish what you've started here. You make sure when you go, you're not going to look around and feel lost." Michael nodded, because that made sense, more than anything else he had been thinking. That evening, he spoke to David. They sat outside, the sky already dark, the quiet of the night settling in. "I told Mum," Michael said. David didn't ask what about. "And? I want to go to town." David exhaled slowly. "I figured." Michael glanced at him. "You did?" David nodded. "You've been moving like someone who's already halfway gone." Michael let out a small breath, almost a laugh. "I'm not leaving yet, I know," David said. "But you will." There was no judgment in it, just understanding. "Are you?" Michael asked. David shook his head slightly. "My path is different." Michael didn't press further, because he understood that too. They were starting from the same place, but they weren't going in the same direction. And that was okay. The following days settled into something new. Not routine, preparation. Michael became more intentional than ever before. At the trading center, he asked more questions. At school, he pushed himself harder. At home, he made sure his responsibilities were not just done, but done well. Not because he was trying to prove anything, but because he understood something clearly now. Where he was going next would depend on how well he handled where he was. One evening, as he stood at the edge of the village again, looking out over the quiet spread of Kirangi, he didn't feel uncertain anymore. The questions were still there, but they didn't weigh on him the same way, because now they had direction. He took a slow breath, then turned back toward home, not rushing, not hesitating, just steady, because for the first time, Michael wasn't just thinking about leaving. He was becoming someone ready to. The change didn't happen all at once. It showed itself in small things first, things no one would have noticed unless they were really paying attention. Michael stopped lingering, where he used to stand and watch people pass at the trading center. Letting time stretch without urgency, he now moved with intention. If there was nothing to do, he found something. If there was something to learn, he stayed until he understood it properly. Even Kamau noticed. "You've started working like someone who's being watched," he said one afternoon, half amused. Michael didn't look up from the small notebook he had begun carrying. "Maybe I am," he replied. Kamau gave a short laugh. "By who?" Michael paused, then said quietly, "By the person I'm trying to become." Kamau didn't respond immediately. He just nodded once, as if he understood more than he needed to say. The notebook became part of Michael's daily routine. It wasn't anything formal, just a small, worn booklet he kept tucked into his pocket. He wrote down prices, observations, and questions, things that didn't make sense yet, patterns he was beginning to notice, which items sold faster, which customers came back, which ones never did. He began to see that business wasn't just about selling something. It was about understanding people. One market day, the trading center was busier than usual. Traders from nearby villages had come in, bringing goods, noise, and a different kind of energy. The air was filled with voices calling out prices, laughter, small arguments over change. Michael moved through it differently that day, not as part of the crowd, but as someone observing it. He noticed a woman who kept returning to the same stall, asking about the price of cooking oil, but never buying. He watched a man who bought tools in bulk, not negotiating much, but asking very specific questions about durability. He followed patterns, connected small details. At one point, Kamau handed him a task, handling a customer who wanted to buy multiple items but was clearly trying to push the price down. In the past, Michael might have hesitated. This time he didn't. He stepped forward, listened carefully, and instead of arguing over price, he adjusted the offer, slightly reducing the cost of one item while maintaining the others. The customer paused, then agreed. Afterward, Kamau raised an eyebrow. "You didn't lower everything," he said. Michael shook his head. He didn't need everything to be cheaper, just enough to feel like he won. Kamau studied him for a second, then gave a small, approving nod. "You're learning." But not everything went smoothly. A few days later, the boy who had taken the item on credit came back. But not with the money. He stood there smaller than before, eyes avoiding Michael's. "My mother said she'll pay later," he muttered. Michael felt a brief, sharp realization. This was the other side of risk. He didn't react immediately, just nodded. "All right," he said. "Tell her I'm waiting." The boy left quickly. Kamau, who had watched the exchange, didn't say anything right away. He waited until the boy was out of sight. "And if she doesn't pay?" he asked. Michael exhaled slowly. "Then I chose wrong," he said. Kamau shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "Then you learn to choose better." That stayed with Michael, because it wasn't just about the money. It was about judgment, and judgment took time. That evening, the weight of that small mistake followed him home. Not heavily, but enough to make him quieter than usual. Benson noticed. "Something didn't go your way," he said as they sat outside. Michael nodded. "I trusted someone too quickly." Benson leaned back slightly. "And now you think that was a mistake?" Michael hesitated. "Wasn't it?" Benson took a moment before answering. "Mistakes aren't trusting," he said. "They're not learning who to trust next." Michael looked at him. "And how do you know the difference?" Benson gave a faint smile. "You don't. Not at first." There was a pause. "Life teaches you," he added, "but only if you're paying attention." Michael nodded slowly, because he was, more than ever. Days turned into weeks, and the idea of leaving Kirangi became less of a distant thought and more of a quiet plan taking shape beneath everything he did. He started asking questions more directly now, not just to Kamau, but to anyone who had seen more than the village. There was an older man who passed through the trading center every few weeks, transporting goods between towns. His name was Njoroge, and he carried stories without ever trying to impress anyone. Michael walked with him one afternoon, offering to help carry a small load just to keep the conversation going. "What's town really like?" Michael asked. Njoroge didn't answer immediately. "It's fast," he said finally. "Faster than you expect." "How?" "People don't wait," he replied. "If you don't move, someone else does." Michael absorbed that, and if you're not ready, Njoroge glanced at him briefly. "Then it shows you." They walked in silence for a few steps, but Njoroge added, "If you are ready, it can change your life." Michael felt something settle deeper inside him. Not excitement, something steadier, a kind of resolve. At home, Mercy began giving him more responsibility without announcing it. Small things at first, managing certain errands, handling decisions she would normally oversee herself. It wasn't random, it was preparation. One evening, she handed him a small amount of money. "Go to the market tomorrow," she said. "Buy what we need for the week." Michael looked at the list, then at her. "You trust me with this?" Mercy met his eyes. "I trust you to learn," she said. The next day, Michael approached the task differently than he would have before. He didn't just buy items. He compared, asked questions, negotiated carefully, not aggressively, but with awareness. By the time he returned, he hadn't just completed the task, he had done it well. Mercy didn't praise him loudly. She just looked through what he brought, nodded once, and said, "Good." But that one word carried weight, more than any long speech. Later that night, as Michael sat outside alone, the village felt different again. Not smaller, just clearer. He could see its rhythm, its limits, its strengths, and his place within it. But more importantly, he could see beyond it. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to know that when the time came, he wouldn't be stepping into the unknown blindly. He would be stepping forward with something solid behind him. Experience, mistakes, lessons, and a quiet confidence that didn't need to be announced. He leaned back slightly, looking up at the sky. For a long time, Kirangi had been his whole world. Now it felt like the beginning of it, and somewhere ahead, not too far but far enough. Something was waiting for him, not by chance, but because he was getting ready to meet it. The weeks that followed didn't feel like waiting anymore. They felt like a slow build, like something gathering strength beneath the surface. Michael stopped measuring his days by how long they felt and started measuring them by what he had taken from them. Some days gave him something clear, others didn't seem to offer much at all. But even on those, he had learned not to dismiss them too quickly. Sometimes the lesson came later. One morning, just before the sun had fully risen, Benson called him outside. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't unusual, but there was something in his tone that made Michael pay closer attention. They took the narrow path that led past their compound, cutting through a stretch of land that hadn't been farmed in a while. The grass there grew uneven, and the ground held the memory of old footsteps rather than fresh ones. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then Benson said, "When I was your age, I thought leaving was the only way to move forward." Michael glanced at him, surprised. Benson didn't often talk about himself like that. "Did you?" Michael asked. Benson nodded slowly. "I did leave for a while," he said. "Not far, just far enough to think things would be different." "And were they?" Benson gave a small, quiet smile. "Some things were," he said, "but most things followed me." Michael frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Benson stopped walking, then turned to face him properly. "You can change your location," he said, "but if you haven't changed how you think, how you decide, how you handle pressure, then you'll carry the same limits with you." The words landed heavier than anything Benson had said before. "I'm not telling you not to go," he added. "You should. You're ready for more than this place." There was no hesitation in that. "But don't go thinking the place will change you," Benson continued. "You're the one who has to do that work first." Michael nodded slowly, because deep down, he understood exactly what his father meant. The walk back was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. Something about that conversation settled inside him, not as doubt, but as grounding. It didn't slow his plans, it sharpened them. That same day, at the trading center, something happened that tested him in a different way. A man came in, older, with a voice that carried authority even when he wasn't raising it. He wanted a large order, larger than anything Kamau usually handled directly. Kamau wasn't there yet. Michael stood behind the stall, listening carefully as the man listed what he needed. The quantities alone made it clear this wasn't a small transaction. In the past, Michael might have told him to come back later. This time he didn't. Instead, he asked questions: where the materials were going, when they were needed, whether the man was open to partial delivery. The man paused, studying him. "You're not the owner," he said. Michael shook his head. "No. But you're answering like one." Michael held his gaze. "I'm trying to understand what you need." There was a brief silence. Then the man nodded slightly. "Good," he said, "because most people just tell me what they have." Michael felt something shift again. That difference between reacting and understanding was becoming clearer to him. By the time Kamau arrived, Michael had already outlined a possible arrangement. Not perfect, not complete, but enough to keep the conversation going. Kamau listened, said little, then stepped in to finalize what he could. After the man left, there was a long pause. Kamau looked at Michael. "You didn't wait," he said. Michael shook his head. "I didn't think I should." Kamau nodded slowly. "You're starting to see ahead," he said. "That's good." Then he added, more quietly, "Just don't outrun your position." Michael understood that too. There was a balance, learning to move forward without stepping beyond what he could actually carry. That evening, something unexpected happened. The boy's mother came, not hurried, not defensive. She walked straight to the stall and placed the money on the counter. "I heard you trusted my son," she said. Michael nodded. "I don't like owing people," she added. Michael picked up the money, counting it quickly. "It's all here," he said. The woman studied him for a moment. "Not everyone would have given him the item," she said. Michael shrugged slightly. "He needed it." She nodded once. Then, before leaving, she said, "Next time, ask more questions first." Michael almost smiled. "I will." After she left, Kamau looked at him again. "You got lucky," he said. Michael shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "I got taught." Kamau let out a small laugh. "Fair enough." At home, the rhythm of things continued, but there was a subtle shift in how everyone related to Michael now. Not dramatically, just enough to notice. Mercy asked his opinion more often. Benson gave him space to make decisions without stepping in too quickly. Even his siblings watched him a little differently, as if they sensed he was moving towards something they couldn't yet define. One evening, as the sun was setting, David found him sitting near the edge of the compound. "You've changed," David said, dropping down beside him. Michael didn't argue. "I've started paying attention," he replied. David nodded. "That's part of it." There was a pause and tension. "When are you going?" David asked. Michael took a breath. "Soon," he said. "Not tomorrow, but not far from now." David picked up a small stone, turning it in his hands. "Kirangi won't feel the same when you leave," he said. Michael looked out toward the fading light. "It already doesn't," he replied. That night, as everything settled into silence again, Michael lay awake, but not the way he used to. There was no confusion, no restless searching, just a quiet awareness that things were aligning, not perfectly, but enough. He thought about the road leading out of the village, the one he had walked so many times without thinking much of it. Soon, it wouldn't just be a road he used, it would be a road he followed, and this time, he wouldn't be walking it as someone wondering what was ahead. He would be walking it as someone ready to find out. The decision didn't announce itself to everyone at once. It showed quietly, the way most real changes do, through small preparations that only made sense when you looked back at them later. Michael started going to the trading center earlier than usual, sometimes arriving before even Kamau had opened up. He would stand there for a moment, keys not his to hold, but responsibility already settling on his shoulders like they were. He had begun to understand something simple but important. If he wanted to move forward, he couldn't keep waiting to be told what to do. One morning, Kamau found him already there, seated on the low wooden bench, notebook open. "You're competing with me now," Kamau joked, unlocking the stall. Michael shook his head. "I'm trying to catch up." Kamau didn't laugh this time. He just nodded and stepped inside. That day was different. Not because of what happened, but because of what Michael chose to do. Instead of staying within the stall, he asked Kamau something he hadn't asked before. "Let me go with you when you restock," he said. Kamau paused, halfway through arranging items. "You think it's exciting?" he asked. Michael shook his head. "I think it's necessary." Kamau studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Tomorrow," he said. That night, Michael didn't talk much at home. Not because he was hiding anything, but because he was holding on to the moment, not wanting to break it by explaining it too early. The next morning, they left before the village had fully woken. The air was cold in that quiet way it only is before sunrise, the kind that makes every sound sharper, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the distant call of a rooster, the low hum of a motorbike passing somewhere far off. They boarded a matatu heading toward town. Michael had been in one before, but this time felt different. He wasn't just going along. He was paying attention to everything, the conversations, the way people negotiated fares, the quick exchanges between conductor and passengers, the way the vehicle filled, emptied, filled again. Movement, constant, efficient, slightly chaotic, but somehow working. When they reached town, Michael felt it immediately. Not just the noise, the pace. People didn't linger. They didn't pause unless there was a reason. Even standing still seemed temporary, like everyone was in the middle of something. Kamau didn't slow down. "Stay close," he said, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. Michael followed, eyes taking in everything. Rows of shops, stacked goods, voices calling out prices, deals being made in seconds. This wasn't like Kirangi. Here things didn't wait for you to understand them. You had to keep up. They reached a larger supply shop tucked between two busy storefronts. It wasn't flashy, but it was organized in a way that spoke of volume, not display. Kamau greeted the owner, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and quick hands. "This is the boy I told you about," Kamau said. The man glanced at Michael briefly, then back at his work. "Can he count?" he asked. Michael stepped forward slightly. "Yes." "Can he listen?" the man added. Michael nodded. "Yes." The man finally looked at him properly. "Good," he said. "Because here, if you miss something, it costs money." That was all the introduction he needed. For the next few hours, Michael didn't just watch. He worked, carrying items, checking quantities, writing down orders, listening to how negotiations happened, not loudly, not aggressively, but with precision. Prices weren't random, they were calculated. Every decision had a reason behind it. At one point, the man handed him a list and asked him to calculate a total. Michael worked through it carefully, double-checking his numbers before handing it back. The man scanned it, then gave a small nod. "You're slow," he said, "but you're accurate." Michael didn't take it as an insult. He took it as direction. By the time they left, the sun was high, and Michael felt something he hadn't expected. Not overwhelmed, not intimidated, challenged, in a way that made him want to come back. On the ride home, Kamau didn't say much, but as they got closer to Kirangi, he finally spoke. "Well?" Michael took a moment before answering. "It's different," he said. Kamau nodded. "That's one word for it." Michael looked out the window, watching the landscape slowly return to something familiar. "I'm not ready yet," he said quietly. Kamau glanced at him. "That's the first correct thing you've said today." Michael almost smiled. "But I can be," he added. Kamau nodded once. "That's the second." When they reached the village, everything felt slower again, but not in a frustrating way. In a clear way. Michael could now see the difference without needing to compare constantly. That evening, he told his parents everything, not dramatically, just as it happened. Mercy listened without interrupting, her expression steady. Benson leaned back, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Michael the entire time. When he finished, there was a brief silence. Then Benson asked, "Do you still want to go?" Michael didn't hesitate. "Yes." Mercy nodded slowly. "Then you prepare properly," she said, "not just with what you've seen, but with what you can handle." Michael understood. This wasn't an approval without conditions. It was trust with expectation. Over the next few days, that understanding shaped everything he did. He became more disciplined with his time, more careful with his decisions, more aware of his limits and how to push them without breaking them. Even his mistakes changed. They became fewer, sharper, more useful. One afternoon, as he stood at the trading center watching the road stretch out beyond the village, he realized something simple but important. For a long time, he had been looking at that road as a way out. Now, he was starting to see it as a way forward, and there was a difference, a quiet, steady difference that showed in how he stood, how he thought, how he chose. Because leaving was no longer just an idea, it was becoming a step, and Michael, without rushing it, without forcing it, was getting ready to take it. The days after the trip to town didn't feel the same, not because anything in Kirangi had changed, but because Michael had. There was a new weight in the way he moved, not heavy, but settled, like he was carrying something he couldn't put down anymore, even if he wanted to. The noise of town, the speed, the sharpness of how people spoke and decided, it stayed with him, and now everything back home felt slower in a way that was hard to ignore. Not frustrating, just clearer. One evening, a few days after the trip, rain came without warning. It started as a distant rumble, the kind people often ignore, but within minutes the sky opened up. The dry roads turned dark and slick, and the trading center emptied quickly as traders rushed to cover their goods. Michael and Kamal worked fast, pulling in items, stacking what they could, covering the rest with old tarpaulins that had seen too many seasons. By the time the rain settled into a steady fall, they were both standing under the narrow shelter, watching the water run along the edges of the road. For a while, they didn't speak. Then Kamal said, almost casually, "You won't stay here long." Michael didn't react immediately. He kept his eyes on the rain. "What makes you say that?" he asked. Kamal shrugged slightly. "You've stopped fitting." That landed deeper than Michael expected. "Fitting?" he repeated. Kamal nodded toward the road, now nearly empty. "Before you were part of this place without thinking about it," he said. "Now you're always measuring it, comparing it. That's not how people stay." Michael let that sit, because it was true. "I don't want to leave like I'm running away," he said after a moment. Kamal shook his head. "You won't," he replied. "People who run don't prepare the way you are." The rain softened slightly, but neither of them moved. "There's something you should understand," Kamal added. "The town will not slow down for you. It won't explain itself. It won't care if you're tired or unsure." Michael nodded. "I saw that." Kamal looked at him. "Seeing is different from living in it," he said. Michael met his gaze. "I'll learn." Kamal held his eyes for a second, then gave a small nod. "That's the only way." When the rain finally eased, the air felt cooler, quieter, like the village had taken a breath. Michael walked home slowly that evening, not because he was tired, but because he was thinking. The road was muddy in places and he had to watch his steps, but his mind was elsewhere, moving through everything he had seen, everything he had been told. By the time he reached home, he had made another decision. This one was clearer. He would not leave unprepared, but he also would not wait too long. That balance was what he needed to get right. Inside, Mercy was finishing up in the kitchen. The smell of food filled the room, warm and familiar. For a moment, Michael just stood there, taking it in. This place, this life, it had shaped him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "You're late," Mercy said, not unkindly. "Rain," Michael replied. She nodded. "Wash up." They ate in the usual quiet rhythm, but halfway through, Benson spoke. "You've been thinking again." Michael glanced up. "I always think." Benson shook his head slightly. "Not like this." There was no point pretending. "I'm trying to figure out when to go," Michael said. The room didn't freeze, but it shifted. Not tense, just attentive. Mercy set her spoon down. "And what have you decided?" she asked. "Not yet," Michael admitted, "but soon." Benson leaned back, studying him. "Soon can mean many things," he said. Michael nodded. "Not months, maybe weeks." There was a long pause. Then Mercy spoke, her voice calm but firm. "Then you use those weeks properly." "I will," Michael said. "No," she replied. "Not just working harder here, preparing for there." Michael listened. "Learn how to manage money beyond small amounts," she continued. "Understand where you will stay, who you will trust. What will you do if things don't go as planned? Michael nodded slowly, because that was the part he hadn't fully built yet. The structure, the plan behind the movement. Later that night, David found him again, sitting outside under the dim light. So it's real now, David said, sitting beside him. Michael didn't deny it. Yeah, he said. It is. David was quiet for a moment. Are you scared? He asked. Michael thought about it, then answered honestly. A little. David nodded. Good. Michael looked at him. Why is it good? Because if you weren't, David said, you'd be walking in blind. Michael let out a small breath. That place, it's not like here, he said. I know, David replied. That's why you're going. There was a pause. Will you come back? David asked. Michael didn't answer immediately. I don't know, he said finally, not the same way. David nodded slowly, as if he had expected that. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was just honest. The next morning, Michael woke up with something he hadn't felt before. A sense of urgency, not rushed, but defined. He didn't waste time. After helping at home, he went straight to the trading center, but this time with a different mindset. He wasn't just learning anymore. He was preparing to apply. Every interaction mattered more now. Every decision felt like practice for something larger. He asked sharper questions, paid closer attention, and took fewer things at face value. Even Kamau adjusted how he treated him. Less instruction, more observations. One afternoon, Kamau handed him a small sum of money. Go, he said, buy what we need from the next center. Michael looked at the money, then at him. Alone? Kamau nodded. Michael didn't hesitate. That short trip wasn't far, but it mattered. He negotiated, compared prices, made choices without someone standing over him. And when he returned, everything he brought made sense not just in quantity, but in value. Kamau checked the items, then the remaining money. No wasted coins, no careless decisions. He nodded once. You're getting there, he said. Michael didn't smile, but inside, something steadied. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the village settled into its familiar rhythm, Michael stood again at the edge of Kirangi. The road stretched out in front of him, the same as always. But now, it didn't feel like something distant. It felt close, close enough to step onto. He took a slow breath, then turned back toward home. Not because he wasn't ready, but because he was almost there, and he understood something clearly now. The difference between wanting to leave and being ready to go. The moment didn't come with an announcement. No one gathered. No speech was made. No single day stood up and said, this is it. It came the way most real decisions do, quietly, after enough small things had added up. Michael woke up that morning before the rooster, before the first light had properly settled over Kirangi. For a few seconds, he lay still, listening. The house was silent in that deep early way that only comes before a day begins. He didn't need to think about it. He already knew. He sat up slowly, rubbed his face, then stood. There was no rush in his movements, but there was no hesitation either. Outside, the air was cold, carrying that familiar smell of damp earth and smoke from fires that had burned out hours earlier. He stood there for a moment, looking out at nothing in particular. Then he went back inside. Mercy was already awake. Not fully dressed, not moving around much, but awake in that way mothers often are, as if sleep never fully takes them. You're up early, she said quietly. Michael nodded. I need to talk to you. She didn't ask what about. She just sat up a little straighter. I'm ready, he said. The words were simple, but they didn't need anything else. Mercy studied his face for a long moment, searching for something uncertain, maybe, or doubt, but she didn't find it. When? She asked. Tomorrow, Michael replied. There was a pause between them, not a shock, not resistance, just a shift. Have you thought it through? She asked. Yes. Where will you stay? Michael nodded. With Kamau's contact. The supplier in town said I could start there, help out, learn. Mercy's eyes held his. And if that doesn't work? I'll adjust, Michael said. But I won't come back just because it's hard. That last part made something flicker in her expression. Not worry, not exactly. Something deeper. Coming back is not failure, she said firmly. Michael nodded. I know, but leaving too soon would be. They held each other's gaze for a moment longer. Then Mercy exhaled softly. All right, she said. No long lectures, no emotional speech, just that. And somehow, it meant everything. Benson found out later that morning. Michael told him while they were outside, going through a small repair that didn't really need two people. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Michael said, tightening a bolt. Benson didn't react immediately. He just kept working for a few seconds, then stopped and leaned back. "Tomorrow," he repeated. Michael nodded. Benson looked at him carefully. "Are you ready for what you don't expect?" he asked. Michael took a breath. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm ready to face it." Benson gave a slow nod. "That's the only kind of preparation that matters." There was no attempt to stop him, no long advice, just a quiet understanding passing between them. The rest of the day moved differently. Word didn't spread fast, but it didn't stay hidden either. By midday, David knew. "You're serious," he said, standing in front of Michael like he was trying to confirm something that still felt unreal. Michael nodded. "Tomorrow." David ran a hand over his head, letting out a short breath. "Just like that?" "It's not just like that," Michael replied. "It's been coming." David knew that. He just hadn't expected it to arrive so soon. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then David stepped forward and pulled him into a quick, firm embrace. "Don't disappear," he said. Michael gave a small, real smile. "I won't." At the trading center, Kamau didn't act surprised. Michael told him in the afternoon when things had slowed down. "I'm going," he said. Kamau nodded like he had been waiting to hear it. "When?" "Tomorrow." Kamau leaned back slightly, folding his arms. "Good," he said. That was it. No dramatic reaction, just approval in its simplest form. But then he added, "Come early." The next morning came faster than expected. Michael didn't carry much. A small bag, a few clothes, his notebook. That was all. Everything else, everything that mattered, wasn't something he could pack. The house felt different as he moved through it for the last time before leaving. Not unfamiliar, just paused. Mercy handed him a small bundle. "Food for the road," she said. Michael took it. "Thank you." She looked at him, her expression steady. "Call when you can," she said. "I will." Benson stood near the door, hands in his pockets. When Michael stepped toward him, he didn't say much. He just placed a hand on his shoulder, firm and steady. "Stand your ground," he said. Michael nodded. "I will." David walked with him part of the way. They didn't talk much at first. The road stretched ahead, the same one they had walked countless times, but this time it carried a different weight. Halfway there, David stopped. "This is far enough," he said. Michael looked at him. "You don't have to stop here." David shook his head. "If I go further, it'll feel like I'm the one leaving." They both smiled slightly, then it faded. "Take care of yourself," David said. "You too." Another brief silence. Then Michael turned, and this time he didn't look back immediately. He walked, past the familiar turns, past the places that had once felt like the edges of his world. The road didn't change, but he did. By the time he reached the Matatu stage, the sun was already climbing, the day beginning like any other. People moved, conversations flowed, life carried on. And just like that, Michael stepped into it, not as someone wondering anymore, not as someone waiting, but as someone who had finally chosen his direction and was ready to live with it. The first part of the journey didn't feel real. Not because anything was strange, but because everything felt too normal. The Matatu filled up the way it always did. People squeezed in, adjusted their seats, complained lightly about space and fares. The conductor shouted destinations with the same tired energy, like he had said the same words too many times to care how they sounded anymore. Michael found a seat by the window. His small bag rested on his lap, one hand holding it loosely, not out of fear, just habit. He watched as the vehicle slowly pulled away, the engine grumbling before settling into its rhythm. Kirangi didn't disappear all at once. It faded. First the houses thinned out, then the familiar shops gave way to open stretches of land. The road widened in places, narrowed in others. Dust followed them for a while, then settled behind. Michael kept his eyes forward. He didn't turn back. Not because he didn't want to, but because he had already said his goodbyes in the only way that mattered. By leaving. The ride was long enough for his thoughts to come and go without settling too heavily. At times he watched the road. At others he studied the people around him, the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves. Some were relaxed, as if they had done this journey 100 times. Others, like him, were quieter, watching, measuring. There was a woman across from him holding a child who kept drifting in and out of sleep, his head falling gently against her shoulder every few minutes. Next to her, a man counted money discreetly, separating notes with careful fingers. Everyone had somewhere to go, everyone had a reason, and for the first time, Michael felt like he belonged in that movement, not as an observer, but as part of it. When they reached Nairobi City, the shift hit him again, but stronger this time. Maybe because now he wasn't just visiting, he was staying. The noise came first, then the motion. People moving in different directions, each one focused, each one carrying something, bags, goods, purpose. Michael stepped out of the matatu, adjusting his grip on his bag. For a moment, he just stood there, not frozen, just taking it in. This was it. No Kamau beside him this time. No one to follow, no one to explain. He took a breath, then moved. The directions Kamau had given him were clear, but the town had a way of making even simple paths feel uncertain. Streets branched off into others, signs competed for attention, and every corner seemed to lead into something new. But Michael didn't rush. He walked steadily, asking when he needed to, listening carefully to instructions, piecing together the route step by step. It took longer than expected, but eventually he found it. The supply shop. It looked the same as the last time, busy, organized in its own controlled way, full without feeling chaotic. The same man stood behind the counter, speaking quickly to someone while checking items on a list. Michael waited. He didn't interrupt. When the man finished, his eyes landed on him. Recognition came quickly. "You came back," he said. Michael nodded. "I've come to stay," he replied. The man studied him for a moment longer this time. "Have you?" he said. Michael didn't flinch. "Yes." There was a short silence. Then the man gestured toward the back. "Put your bag there," he said. "Then come." No long welcome, no ceremony, just work. And Michael understood that was the opportunity. The first hours passed quickly, faster than anything back in Kirangi. There was no easing into it. Tasks came one after another, items to move, numbers to check, instructions to follow. At one point, the man called out to him sharply, correcting how he had stacked a set of materials. "Not like that," he said. "You waste space." Michael adjusted immediately. No argument, no explanation, just a correction and learning. By midday, his hands were tired, his shirt slightly damp, his mind working faster than it was used to. But he didn't slow down, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't want to. He was keeping up, barely, but enough. Later, during a short break, he stepped outside. The street was just as busy as before, but now it felt different. Less overwhelming, more readable. He could see the flow, the patterns, where people slowed, where they rushed, where attention shifted. He took a sip of water, then leaned lightly against the wall. For a brief moment, the weight of it all settled in. He was here, not visiting, not passing through, living it. And it wasn't easy, it wasn't comfortable, but it felt right. Back inside, the man called him again. "What's your name?" he asked. "Michael." The man nodded. "I'm Kimani," he said. "If you're going to stay, you work properly." "I will," Michael replied. Kimani held his gaze for a second, then said, "We'll see." The rest of the day moved even faster. Mistakes happened, small ones, a miscount, a delayed response, a moment of hesitation that cost a few seconds too many. Each time Kimani corrected him, direct, clear, no softening, but also no dismissal. That mattered. By the time evening came, Michael felt it in his body. The kind of tiredness that didn't just sit in your muscles but in your focus. Still, when Kimani finally said, "That's enough for today," Michael didn't feel like stopping. He felt like he had just begun. Outside, the light was fading. The town didn't quiet down the way Kirangi did. It shifted, but it didn't settle. The noise softened in some places, grew in others. Michael picked up his bag, stepping out into it again. For a second, he wasn't sure where to go. Then he remembered. A small room had been arranged, nothing special, just a place to sleep. He found it after asking twice. It was simple, a bed, a small window, bare walls, but it was his. He placed his bag down, sat on the edge of the bed, and let out a slow breath. No one spoke. No familiar voices, no routines waiting for him, just silence, different from home, but not empty. He lay back, staring at the ceiling. The day replayed itself, not in full, just in pieces. The corrections, the movement, the pace, and beneath it all, a quiet realization. This was only the beginning, not the moment everything changed, but the place where change would happen. Slowly, through effort, through mistakes, through showing up again the next day. Michael closed his eyes, not thinking about how far he had come, not worrying about how far he had to go, just holding on to one simple truth. He had taken the step, and now he had to keep moving. The second day didn't wait for him to feel ready. It started before he had fully settled into sleep. Michael woke up to unfamiliar sounds, metal shutters rolling open somewhere nearby, voices already rising in the distance, footsteps passing his small room like the day had been going on long before he joined it. For a moment, he lay still, trying to place himself. Then it came back. Town, work, Kimani. He sat up slowly, the thin mattress shifting under him, and ran a hand over his face. His body felt it, the work from the day before sitting on his shoulders, in his arms. But it wasn't the kind of tiredness that held him back. It reminded him. He stood, washed quickly using the cold water from a plastic basin, dressed without overthinking, and stepped outside. The morning air in town wasn't like Kirangi's. It didn't ease you into the day, it met you already in motion. By the time he reached the shop, Kimani was there, already working. No greeting, just a quick glance. "You're on time," he said. Michael nodded. That was enough. The work began immediately. No warm-up, no explanation. Kimani handed him a list and pointed toward a section of the shop. "Check everything," he said. "Count properly." Michael took the list and got to it. At first, it seemed simple. Numbers, items, matching what was there to what was written. But it didn't take long to realize this wasn't just counting. It was attention. Some items were stacked unevenly, others were placed in ways that made quick counting difficult. A few were similar enough to confuse someone moving too fast. Michael slowed down, not physically, but mentally. He focused, double-checked, took his time without wasting it. An hour passed, then another. When he handed the list back, Kimani scanned it quickly, then paused at one point. "This is wrong," he said. Michael stepped closer. Kimani pointed. "You missed 2. Michael looked again, and there they were, partially hidden behind another stack. He nodded. "I see it." Kimani looked at him. "Seeing late is still missing," he said. Michael didn't argue. "I'll do better." Kimani held his gaze for a second, then handed the list back. "Go again." Michael took it. No frustration, just a correction. And he started over. By midday, the pace picked up. Customers came in waves, some quick, knowing exactly what they wanted. Others were slower, asking questions, comparing, deciding. Kimani handled most of them, but not all. At one point, he stepped aside slightly. "Talk to him," he said, nodding toward a man waiting near the counter. Michael moved forward. The man looked at him briefly, then continued speaking. "I need these in bulk," he said, listing items without pause. Michael listened carefully, not interrupting. When the man finished, Michael repeated part of the order back, not all, just enough to confirm. The man nodded. "Good," he said. "At least you're listening." Michael asked a few questions. Delivery, timing, whether substitutions were acceptable. Not too many, just enough. When Kimani stepped back in, the conversation moved quickly. After the man left, Kimani said nothing for a while. Then quietly, "Don't rush to speak. But don't hesitate either." Michael nodded. That balance again. Always that balance. Later in the afternoon, something small but important happened. Michael made a mistake. Not a big one, but clear. He gave out the wrong quantity for an order, misreading a number in a moment where things were moving quickly. The customer noticed. Kimani noticed faster. "What did you write?" he asked sharply. Michael checked, then froze for half a second. It was wrong. He corrected it immediately, adjusting the order, apologizing without over-explaining. The customer accepted it and moved on, but Kimani didn't. "Come here," he said. Michael stepped closer. "You were thinking ahead instead of focusing on what was in front of you," Kimani said. Michael didn't deny it. "I was trying to keep up." Kimani shook his head. "Keeping up doesn't mean rushing," he said. It means staying accurate under pressure. Michael felt that because it was true. That mistake stayed with him for the rest of the day, not as something heavy, but as something sharp, a reminder. When evening came again, Michael didn't step outside immediately. He stayed back a little longer, organizing a section that didn't need urgent attention. Kimani noticed. "You can go," he said. Michael shook his head slightly. "I'll finish this." Kimani watched him for a moment, then turned away without saying anything. That was enough. Back in his room that night, the silence felt less unfamiliar, still quiet, still different, but no longer distant. He sat on the edge of the bed again, his notebook in his hands. He hadn't written in it all day. Now he did. Not everything, just key things, mistakes, corrections, observations. The difference between how he thought something should be done and how it actually worked. He paused at one point, staring at the page, then added one more line. "Don't think ahead of what you can handle. Focus on what's in front of you." He closed the notebook and leaned back slightly. For the first time since arriving, he allowed himself a longer breath. Not because things were easy, but because they were starting to make sense. Not fully, but enough to keep going. He lay down, the sounds of town still moving faintly outside his window, and before sleep took him, one thought stayed clear in his mind. This place wasn't going to shape itself around him. He would have to shape himself within it, and that work. It had already begun. By the end of the first week, Michael stopped counting the days, not because they didn't matter, but because each one had started to feel full in its own way. Morning came fast, work filled the hours, and by the time evening arrived, there was barely space left to think about anything else. It wasn't the kind of life he had known in Kirangi. There, time had stretched. Here, it moved. And if you didn't move with it, you felt it immediately. The routine began to settle into him. Wake up early, wash, step into the street before the day had fully taken shape. Walk to the shop while everything around him was already building momentum. Kimani was always there first, always. Michael never asked how early he arrived. It didn't matter. What mattered was that he never found him unprepared. That alone taught him something without a word being spoken. One morning, as Michael stepped into the shop, he noticed something different. A new stock of materials had been delivered overnight. Larger than usual, packed tightly, arranged with precision. Kimani didn't point it out. He didn't need to. Michael walked toward it, studying the arrangement. "Figure it out," Kimani said from across the room. Michael nodded. No further instruction. He started slowly checking labels, tracing where items had been placed, understanding why certain things were stacked together and others kept apart. It took time, more than he expected. At one point, he moved a set of items to what he thought was a better position. Kimani noticed immediately. "Put it back," he said. Michael paused. "I thought." "Don't think for me," Kimani cut in. "Understand first." Michael held the moment, then nodded. He returned everything exactly as it had been. That stayed with him. There was a difference between initiative and assumption, and he was still learning where that line sat. Later that day, something else shifted. Kimani stepped out for longer than usual. Before leaving, he said only one thing. "If anyone comes, handle it." Then he was gone. Michael stood there for a moment after the door closed. The shop didn't stop. It never did. Within minutes, the first customer came in, then another, then two more, almost at the same time. Michael moved into it. Not perfectly, not as smoothly as Kimani, but he didn't freeze. He listened, responded, managed. At one point, he had to make a decision without being sure if it was the right one, adjusting an order based on what was available, not what was requested. The customer hesitated. Michael explained calmly, "Not too much, just enough." After a moment, the man nodded. "Fine," he said. "Do it your way." That small agreement felt bigger than it should have, not because it was perfect, but because it was his. When Kimani returned, he didn't ask immediately what had happened. He just looked around, checked a few things, then finally said, "Did anything go wrong?" Michael shook his head. "Not wrong," he said, "but not everything was clear." Kimani nodded. "That's normal." That was it. No praise, but no correction either. And somehow, That told Michael more than anything else. That evening, on his way back to his room, something caught his attention. A small food stall set up near the corner with a woman serving tea and simple meals to workers passing by. It wasn't anything special, just a few benches, a charcoal stove, the smell of something warm cooking. He had passed it before, but this time he stopped. Not because he was hungry, but because he was noticing more. The way people gathered there, the quick exchanges, the familiarity between the woman and her customers. It reminded him of something, not the place, the feeling, connection. Even in a place that moved as fast as this, people still found small spaces to slow down. He ordered tea, sat quietly, listened. No one paid him much attention, and he preferred it that way. For the first time since arriving, he wasn't thinking about work. He was just observing again, the way he used to, but now with more understanding behind it. Back in his room that night, he didn't go straight to sleep. He sat with his notebook again, but this time he didn't just write about mistakes or corrections. He wrote about patterns, what worked, what people responded to, where he hesitated, and why. He paused, pen resting lightly against the page, then wrote something he hadn't fully said to himself yet. "I'm starting to find my place." He stared at the words for a moment, not fully convinced, but not doubting them either, because something was changing, not loudly, not in a way anyone else would point out, but in the way he stood, the way he spoke, the way he decided. The next day, that change showed itself. A customer came in a difficult way from the start, questioning everything, challenging prices, pushing for more than what made sense. Michael handled it, not by pushing back harder, but by staying steady, answering clearly, not getting pulled into unnecessary arguments. At one point, the man leaned forward slightly. "You're new," he said. Michael nodded. "Still learning." The man studied him, then leaned back. "At least you know that," he said. And just like that, the tension dropped. The sale went through, not perfect, but fair. After he left, Kimani looked at Michael briefly. "You didn't react," he said. Michael shrugged slightly. There was nothing to react to. Kimani gave a small nod. "That's how you last here." That stayed with Michael more than anything else that day. Because it wasn't just about business. It was about control. Of yourself. Of your decisions. Of your pace. That night, as he lay down again, the sounds of town no longer felt like noise. They felt like rhythm. Something he was beginning to understand. Something he was slowly becoming part of. And for the first time since he had left Kirangi, Michael didn't feel like someone who had just arrived. He felt like someone who had started building something. Not finished, not even close, but real, and growing, one steady day at a time. It was sometime in the second week when Michael realized that the work was no longer the hardest part of his day. It was the thinking, not the kind he had known back in school, where answers were either right or wrong, written neatly on paper. This was different. Here, every decision carried weight, even the small ones: where to place an item, how to respond to a customer, when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. That morning had started like any other. The sky still carried that pale grey light before sunrise, and the streets were already awake. Boda-bodas passing, voices calling out, someone dragging a crate across the road with a rough scraping sound that echoed between buildings. Michael walked at his usual pace, not rushing, not slow, just steady. When he reached the shop, Kimani was inside, going through a ledger. He didn't look up immediately. "Close the door," he said. Michael did. There was something about the way the words were said, calm but deliberate. Kimani tapped the page in front of him. "Come here." Michael stepped closer. The ledger was open to a page filled with numbers. Not neat, not messy, just used. You could tell it had been handled often, pages slightly worn at the edges. "Look," Kimani said. Michael leaned in. At first it didn't make sense. Just figures, entries, dates. But as he focused, patterns began to form. "Something is off," Kimani said. Michael stayed quiet, eyes moving slowly across the page. He didn't rush to answer. He had learned that much. A few minutes passed. Then he saw it. Not a big mistake. A small inconsistency. A number that didn't align with the rest. Not wildly wrong, but just enough to create a shift if you followed it through. He pointed. "There." he said. Kimani watched him, then followed his finger. A pause, then a small nod. Good, he said. But he didn't stop there. Now tell me why it matters. Michael hesitated for a second, then spoke. It changes everything that comes after it, he said, even if it looks small. Kimani closed the ledger. Exactly. He stood up. That's business, he added. Mistakes don't stay where they start. That stayed with Michael long after they had moved on from the ledger, because it wasn't just about numbers, it was about consequences. The rest of the morning moved quickly. Deliveries came in, customers followed. The usual rhythm, but sharper now, more demanding. At some point, a man walked in who didn't look like the usual customers. Well-dressed, but not flashy. Quiet, but observant. The kind of person who didn't need to say much to be noticed. He greeted Kimani briefly, like they had met before, then stepped aside, looking around the shop. Kimani turned to Michael. Handle him, he said. Michael felt it immediately. This wasn't the same as the others. Still, he walked over. Good morning, he said. The man nodded. I'm looking for consistency, he said. Michael blinked slightly. In what? Supply, the man replied. Anyone can sell once. Not everyone can deliver again. Michael took that in. This wasn't about a single purchase. It was about trust. He asked a few questions, not too many, just enough to understand what the man needed. Quantities, timing, expectations. As the conversation went on, Michael noticed something. The man wasn't just listening to what he said, he was watching how he said it. The pauses, the confidence, the certainty or lack of it. Michael didn't try to pretend he knew everything. Where he was sure, he spoke clearly. Where he wasn't, he said so. I'd need to confirm that, he admitted at one point. The man gave a small nod. Better than guessing, he said. When Kimani joined them again, the discussion became more detailed. Numbers, timelines, agreements that went beyond a simple sale. Michael stepped back slightly, but he stayed close enough to follow, learning without being told. After the man left, the shop felt quieter for a moment. Not physically, but in weight. Kimani turned to Michael. What did you notice? He asked. Michael thought for a second. He wasn't buying products, he said slowly. He was choosing who to trust. Kimani's expression didn't change much, but there was something in his eyes. Good, he said. That afternoon the pace didn't slow. If anything, it picked up. And that was when the mistake came. Not from confusion, from assumption. A regular customer came in, someone Michael had already dealt with before. Without thinking too much, he prepared the usual order. The man stopped him. That's not what I asked for today, he said. Michael paused. For a second, it felt small. Then it didn't. He had assumed. Again, he corrected it quickly, adjusted the order, and apologized simply. No excuses. The man didn't make a big issue out of it, but the moment stayed. Kimani didn't say anything immediately, but later, when things had calmed slightly, he spoke. Routine can make you careless, he said. Michael nodded. I see that. Every day is different, Kimani continued, even with the same people. That lesson felt heavier than the others, because it was easy to fall into comfort, easy to think you understood something fully, when you didn't. That evening, Michael didn't go straight back to his room. He found himself walking again, without a clear destination, just moving. The town looked different at that hour. Not quieter, but softer somehow. Lights coming on, conversations shifting, the rush of the day easing into something else. He passed the same food stall again. This time, the woman recognized him. You came back, she said, smiling slightly. Michael nodded. The tea was good. She laughed softly. That's how it starts. He sat down. This time, he didn't just observe. He spoke a little. Nothing deep, just small exchanges. Where he was from, how long he had been around. Simple things, but even that felt like progress. Because a few days ago, he wouldn't have said anything at all. Back in his room, the notebook waited. He opened it slowly, flipping through the pages he had already filled. Each one carried something, a mistake, a realization, a shift in how he saw things. He picked up his pen, then stopped. For a long moment he didn't write. He just sat there thinking, not about the day alone, but about the direction, where this was leading. Then finally he wrote, You don't learn everything at once. You notice it in pieces. He added another line beneath it. and if you're not paying attention, you miss the most important ones. He closed the notebook gently, lay back. The sounds outside no longer distracted him. They settled around him, familiar now. And as sleep came, one thought stayed steady. He wasn't just working anymore. He was beginning to understand. By the third week, something had shifted in a way Michael couldn't easily explain. Nothing around him had changed. The same streets, the same shop, the same routine. But he was different inside it. He no longer stood at the edge of things trying to catch up. He had started to move with them quietly, without drawing attention to it, but enough that the day no longer felt like something happening to him. That morning began with rain. Not heavy at first. Just a slow, steady fall that darkened the road and pulled a different kind of silence over the town. The usual dust had settled, replaced by the smell of wet earth and damp wood. Michael hesitated briefly at his door, watching the rain hit the ground in small, consistent patterns. Back in Kirangi, rain meant a pause. Here, it meant adjustment. He stepped out anyway. By the time he reached the shop, his shirt carried small patches of water, but he didn't mind. Kimani was already there, as expected, standing just inside the entrance, looking out at the rain like he had been watching it for a while. "People will come late today," he said. Michael nodded. "But they'll still come." That part mattered more. The morning moved slower than usual, but not idle. Instead of the usual rush, there were longer gaps between customers, and in those gaps, Kimani didn't let time go to waste. "Come," he said, motioning toward the back. Michael followed. There was a section of the shop he hadn't spent much time in, older stock, rarely touched, stacked in a way that suggested it had been left alone for a while. "Start here," Kimani said. Michael looked at the shelves. Dust lightly coated some of the items. Others had faded labels. A few looked like they hadn't been moved in months. "What am I doing?" Michael asked. Kimani crossed his arms. "Decide what stays," he said. "What moves, what goes." Michael glanced at him. "How?" Kimani didn't answer immediately, then simply, "Think," and he walked away. Michael stood there alone for a moment. This wasn't like counting stock. There was no clear list, no right or wrong in front of him, just judgment. He picked up the first item, turning it in his hands, checking the condition, the label, trying to remember if he had seen anyone ask for it since he arrived. Nothing came to mind. He set it aside, then another and another. Slowly, a system began to form in his head. Not perfect, but something. Things that moved fast, things that moved sometimes, things that didn't move at all. Time passed without him noticing. At one point, Kimani returned, standing quietly behind him. "You're separating," he said. Michael nodded. "Why that one?" Kimani asked, pointing to a pile. "It hasn't moved," Michael said, "and it's taking space." Kimani picked it up, examining it briefly. "Space costs," he said, "even when you don't see it." He placed it back down. "But don't remove everything that's slow," he added. "Some things take time." Michael understood. Not everything useless was obvious, and not everything slow was worthless. That line again, always that line. By midday, the rain had picked up, harder now, louder. Customers began to come in more steadily, people trying to finish their business before the weather got worse. The shop filled quickly, voices overlapping, water drips from clothes. The floor was slightly slippery near the entrance. It was busy in a different way, messier, less controlled. At one point, a disagreement broke out between two customers over an order that had been mixed up, not by Michael, but he was the one closest. The voices rose quickly, sharp, impatient. Michael stepped in, not loudly, but firmly enough to be heard. "Let's check it properly," he said. One of the men waved his hand dismissively. "It's obvious," he said. "He took what was mine." Michael didn't argue. He just moved to the counter, checked the order book, then the items themselves. Took his time, didn't rush to match their energy. After a minute, he looked up. "It's not mixed," he said calmly. "It was written separately." There was a pause. The tension didn't disappear immediately, but it shifted. Facts had a way of doing that. One of the men exhaled, stepping back slightly. The other nodded. The moment passed. Not perfectly, but enough. When things settled, Kimani glanced at Michael briefly. No words, just a look, and somehow that felt like acknowledgement. Later in the afternoon, the rain began to ease. The light changed again, brighter now, reflecting off the wet ground, giving everything a cleaner, sharper look. The rush slowed, and for the first time that day, there was space to breathe. Michael leaned lightly against the counter, not in exhaustion, but in thought. He replayed parts of the day in his head. The sorting, the decisions, the argument, not focusing on what he did right or wrong, just understanding it. Kimani walked past him. "Don't get comfortable," he said. Michael gave a small smile. "I'm not." "Good," Kimani replied. "Comfort is where mistakes hide." That line stayed with him longer than most, because it was true in a way that felt bigger than the shop. That evening, Michael didn't go straight back again. Instead, he walked a little further than usual. The rain had left the air cooler. The streets were still damp, reflecting the lights from shops and passing vehicles. He found himself near a busier part of town, people moving in different directions, conversations blending into one steady hum. For a moment, he just stood there, watching, not as someone lost, but as someone seeing more clearly. He noticed how people interacted, how quickly decisions were made, how little hesitation there was in some and how much in others. He saw pieces of himself in both, and that made him pause. Because he was changing, not all at once, not in a way that could be pointed out easily, but in the way he responded, the way he thought, the way he carried himself. Back in his room, he didn't rush to the notebook this time. He sat first, let the day settle. Then slowly he opened it. He didn't write immediately. When he did, it was shorter than usual. Not everything is about speed. A pause, then, and not everything slow is a mistake. He looked at the words for a while, then he closed the notebook. As he lay down, the sounds of the town no longer felt like something outside of him. They felt familiar, like something he was part of now. And as his eyes closed, one thought stayed steady. He wasn't just finding his place anymore. He was beginning to hold it. The days that followed didn't announce themselves as important. They came the same way, morning light creeping in quietly, footsteps in the corridor, the distant hum of a town already in motion. But somewhere inside those ordinary days, something began to take shape for Michael in a way he hadn't expected. It started with small trust, not given all at once, earned, one piece at a time. Kimani no longer watched him as closely as before. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't need to. Instructions became fewer, corrections became sharper but less frequent, and sometimes whole parts of the day would pass without Kimani saying anything at all. At first, Michael noticed the silence. Then he understood it. It meant he was being allowed to stand on his own. One morning, Kimani arrived later than usual. That alone felt unusual. Michael was already at the shop, keys in hand, standing outside for a moment before opening it. For a brief second, he hesitated, not out of fear, but out of awareness. This was new. Then he unlocked the door and stepped in. The air inside felt still, untouched from the night before. He moved through the space slowly at first, opening windows, adjusting items, setting things in place the way he had seen Kimani do countless times, not copying blindly, understanding. By the time the first customer arrived, the shop was ready. Michael handled it. Then another came, then two more. The morning picked up quickly, and before he realized it, he was fully inside the rhythm of it, responding, adjusting, deciding. At one point, he paused briefly, realizing something. He wasn't thinking about what Kimani would do. He was thinking about what needed to be done. That difference was quiet, but it mattered. When Kimani finally arrived, he didn't ask what had happened. He just looked around, took in the arrangement, the flow, the way things were moving. Then he placed his bag down and said, almost casually, "You opened." Michael nodded. Kimani gave a small, almost unnoticeable nod in return. That was all. But for Michael, it carried weight, because it wasn't just acknowledgement, it was acceptance. That same day, something bigger came, a delivery larger than usual, more complicated than the others. Multiple items, different quantities, some already paid for, others still pending. It wasn't the kind of task given lightly. Kimani stood beside the truck, scanning the papers. Then he handed them to Michael. "Handle it," he said. Michael took them, feeling the weight not of the papers but of the responsibility. He moved carefully, checking items one by one, matching quantities, not rushing even when the workers unloading the truck grew impatient. "Boss, we need to move," one of them said. Michael didn't look up immediately. "We will," he replied calmly. "But we do it right." There was a pause. Then they adjusted. The work continued. It took longer than usual, but when it was done, everything was in place, accurate, clear, no confusion left behind. Kimani checked a few items himself. Then he looked at Michael. "You didn't rush," he said. Michael shook his head slightly. "I wanted it done properly." Kimani held his gaze for a second, then said something he hadn't said before. "Good." It was a simple word, but it landed differently because it had been earned. That evening felt different too. Not louder, not brighter, just steadier. Michael walked back through the streets with a pace that matched how he felt inside, grounded, aware, no longer trying to prove anything to himself every step of the way. He passed the food stall again. The woman looked up and smiled. "You look less lost today," she said lightly. Michael smiled back. "Maybe I am." She handed him his tea without asking. He sat for a while, watching the same familiar movements around him, but now he didn't feel like an outsider observing them. He felt like someone who belonged within them. Not completely, but enough. That night in his room, the notebook lay where it always did. He opened it slowly, flipping through pages filled over the past weeks. He could see the journey in his own handwriting. The early uncertainty, the mistakes, the lessons, the shift. He picked up his pen and paused, then began to write. Not just a line this time, but something fuller. Michael's time in the shop had not been marked by big moments, but by steady change. What began as simple tasks, counting, arranging, observing, slowly turned into understanding. He learned that business was not just about selling, but about paying attention, about accuracy, about patience, about knowing when to act and when to hold back. Working with Kimani taught him discipline without softness. There were no unnecessary words, no praise given freely, but in that silence, Michael found clarity. Every correction had a purpose. Every responsibility came with weight. He made mistakes, some small, some enough to stay with him for days. But he learned not to hide from them. Instead, he adjusted, watched more closely, thought more carefully. Over time, the work stopped feeling foreign. The shop stopped feeling like a place he was trying to fit into and became a place he understood. Customers were no longer just people passing through. They were patterns, behaviors, decisions to be read and responded to. And without realizing it all at once, Michael had changed. He was no longer just learning how to work. He was learning how to think. He stopped writing and leaned back slightly, read it again. It didn't feel exaggerated. It felt true. He added one final line at the bottom, and that was only the beginning. He closed the notebook and placed it beside him. As he lay down, the room felt different again. Not bigger, not smaller, just his. And for the first time since he had left Kirangi, Michael allowed himself to think beyond the present. Not too far, just enough. Because somewhere inside him, something had started to grow. Not just confidence, but direction. He didn't know exactly where it would lead, but he knew this much. He was ready for the next step. After some time of working with Kimani, the thought didn't come to Michael all at once. It built slowly, the way most real decisions do quietly, without announcement, forming in the background of his days until it could no longer be ignored. At first, it showed up as a question. Not loud, just a present. What next? He didn't rush to answer it. Life at the shop had become steady, predictable in a way that no longer felt limiting, but grounding. He knew the rhythm now, the early mornings, the careful checking of stock, the flow of customers, the discipline of getting things right, even when no one was watching closely. He had earned his place there. That much was clear. But something inside him had started to stretch beyond it, not out of dissatisfaction, but growth. It showed in small ways. The way he began to notice opportunities outside the shop, gaps in supply, people asking for things that weren't available, conversations between customers that hinted at needs no one was meeting properly. The way he started thinking beyond the counter, not just about completing a transaction, but about where it came from and where it went after. One evening, after closing, Michael stayed behind longer than usual. Kimani had already stepped out briefly, leaving him to finish up. The shop was quiet, still. Michael moved slowly, arranging a few items that didn't need arranging, more out of habit than necessity. Then he stopped, resting his hands lightly on the counter. He looked around, not as someone learning anymore, but as someone who understood. Every shelf held a pattern he had come to recognize. Every corner had taught him something about attention, about discipline, about patience. And for the first time, he allowed himself to say it clearly in his own mind. I can do this. Not just here, but beyond. When Kimani returned, he found Michael still there. You haven't left, he said. Michael shook his head. I was just finishing up. Kimani looked around briefly, then at him. Everything is done. It wasn't a question. Michael nodded. There was a pause. Then, without planning it too much, Michael spoke. I've been thinking, he said. Kimani didn't interrupt. I've learned a lot here, Michael continued. More than I expected. Kimani leaned slightly against the counter, arms folded. And? He asked. Michael hesitated, not out of doubt, but to choose his words carefully. I don't want to stop here. The words settled between them. Kimani didn't react immediately. He had never been quick with responses. What do you want? He asked after a moment. Michael exhaled quietly. I want to try something of my own, he said, even if it's small. There it was, simple, clear, honest. Kimani's eyes stayed on him, steady, unreadable for a second. Then he nodded once. Good. The answer came so plainly that Michael almost wasn't sure he had heard it right. Kimani straightened slightly. If you stay here forever, then you didn't learn properly, he said. Michael felt that, deeply. But don't rush out just because you feel ready, Kimani added. Make sure you are ready. Michael nodded. I understand. Kimani pushed himself off the counter. Come earlier tomorrow, he said. We talk. That night, Michael didn't sleep immediately. Not because he was worried, but because his mind was active in a different way. He sat with his notebook open again, but this time, the pages ahead felt different from the ones behind. He wasn't writing about what had happened. He was beginning to write about what could. Ideas. Small ones. Practical ones. Nothing grand, but real. Things he had seen. Things he understood now. Where to start. What he would need. What he didn't yet know. He wrote until his thoughts slowed, then closed the book carefully. The next morning came earlier than usual. Michael arrived before Kimani this time. Not by much, but enough. When Kimani walked in, he noticed immediately. Good, he said. They didn't start working right away. Instead, Kimani pulled out a chair and sat down. Sit, he said. Michael did. What followed wasn't a lecture. It was a conversation. The kind that only comes after time has been spent. After respect has been built without needing to be spoken. What you're thinking is right, Kimani said. But thinking is easy. Michael listened. What matters is structure, Kimani continued. Where will you get your goods? How will you move them? Who will trust you when you're starting? Michael answered where he could, admitted where he couldn't. Kimani didn't fill every gap, but he pointed at them, clearly. You don't need everything figured out, he said. But you need to know what you don't know. That stayed more than anything else. Over the next few days, things changed again, but not in a dramatic way. Michael still worked, still showed up, still handled the shop with the same focus. But alongside that, something new was being built. After work, he moved differently. He paid attention to suppliers, asked quiet questions, listened more than he spoke. He walked parts of town he hadn't explored before. Not aimlessly, but with intention now, looking, understanding, mapping things in his head. The food stall became more than a place to sit. It became a place where he heard things, conversations about shortages, delays, prices going up, people complaining about not finding what they needed on time. all small pieces, but they connected, and slowly a direction formed. Not perfect, but enough to start. The day he finally spoke to Kimani again about it, he was calmer than he expected. "I found something," he said. Kimani looked at him. "Show me," Michael explained. Simple, direct. What he had seen, what he planned to try, why it made sense. Kimani didn't interrupt. When he finished, there was a long pause. Then Kimani nodded. "It's small," he said. Michael nodded. "I know. It's supposed to be," Kimani replied. Another pause. Then, "When do you start?" Michael felt it in that moment. Not pressure, not fear, but a shift. "I'm ready to begin preparing," he said. Kimani studied him for a second. Then, for the first time since Michael had known him, there was the slightest hint of something softer in his expression. "Finish your time here properly," he said. "Don't leave gaps behind you." Michael understood. "I won't." And he didn't. The last days at the shop were not emotional. They were precise, clean. He worked the same way he always had. No slowing down, no distraction. If anything, he was sharper, more present, because he knew what this place had given him, and he respected it enough to leave it the right way. On his final day, there were no speeches, no ceremony, just work, like any other day. When evening came and the shop was closing, Michael stood for a moment near the door, not lingering, just acknowledging. Kimani walked over, standing beside him. "You'll come back," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Michael nodded. "Of course." Kimani reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded paper. He handed it to him. Michael looked at it. "What is it?" he asked. "A contact," Kimani said. "You'll need it." Michael took it carefully. "Thank you." Kimani gave a slight nod, then added, "Don't waste time trying to be perfect." Michael looked at him. "Just be consistent." That was it. No long goodbye, no unnecessary words, and somehow that made it feel real. Michael stepped out into the evening again, the same streets he had walked for weeks now, but this time it felt different. Not because the town had changed, but because he had. He wasn't walking back to his room as someone was trying to find his place. He was walking forward as someone who had already started building one. And as the night settled around him, one thing was clear in his mind. The chapter with Kimani hadn't ended. It had done what it was meant to do. It had prepared him. And now, he was stepping into something that was his. The first morning without the shop felt longer than it should have. Michael woke up at the same time his body had learned over the past weeks, before the sun had fully risen, before the noise of the town had built into its usual rhythm. For a few seconds he lay still, expecting the familiar pull, the need to get up quickly, to get ready, to be somewhere. But there was no Kimani waiting, no shop to open, no list already forming in his head. He sat up slowly, resting his elbows on his knees, looking at the small room that had become his space. Nothing had changed in it. The same bed, the same basin, the same notebook placed near the edge where he had left it the night before. But the meaning of the room had shifted. Before, it was where he returned. Now, it was where he started. He stood, washed his face, and stepped outside. The air felt cooler than usual, or maybe he was just noticing more. People were already moving, boda riders warming their engines, a woman arranging vegetables on a wooden table, a man sweeping dust from in front of his shop, even though it would return within minutes. Life didn't slow down because he had changed, and that grounded him. He began walking, not toward the shop this time, but through the streets he had only passed before without stopping. Now he looked at things differently, not as someone trying to get somewhere, but as someone trying to understand where he was. He paid attention to how people set up their businesses, those who came early, who came late, which places gathered crowds and which ones stayed quiet. He watched how money moved, not in large amounts, but in small, constant exchanges. A cup of tea, a quick repair, a delivery dropped off without ceremony. It all added up. By mid-morning, he found himself near the same food stall again. The woman saw him and smiled, already reaching for a cup before he even spoke. "So now you come without rushing," she said. Michael smiled slightly. "I have time today." She handed him the tea. "Time is good," she said, "if you know what to do with it." He sat down. That sentence stayed with him longer than the tea lasted. Over the next few days, a routine began to form again, but this time it was his. Mornings were for movement. He walked, observed, sometimes spoke to people, sometimes just listened. He began to recognize faces, not just as strangers passing by, but as part of the same system he was slowly becoming a part of. Afternoons were for planning. Back in his room, or sometimes sitting under a quiet corner somewhere, notebook open, he would write. Not just ideas, but steps. What he needed, what he could afford, who he might need to talk to. Evenings were different. They became social, not in a loud way, but in a steady one. The food stall became a regular stop, and through it, people began to notice him. At first, he was just the quiet one who came for tea. Then he became the one who stayed a little longer, who asked simple questions, who listened more than he spoke. That's how he met Peter. It wasn't planned. Peter was a delivery rider, quick, always moving, always seeming to be on his way somewhere else. The first time they spoke, it was over something small. "You sit here a lot," Peter said, dropping onto the bench beside him. Michael nodded. "I like watching." Peter laughed. "Watching won't make you money." Michael looked at him calmly. "Depends on what you see." That caught Peter's attention. From then on, the conversations grew naturally. Peter spoke about the town in a way Michael hadn't heard before. Not from the outside, but from inside its movement. Which routes were faster and closer, which suppliers delayed, who could be trusted, who talked more than they delivered, information that didn't exist in books. Another person came into his circle not long after Amina. She ran a small stall selling household items not far from the main road, organized, sharp and direct in the way she spoke. Michael first approached her as a customer for some good weeks after leaving Kimani's shop. Mikhail stayed as a daily loyal customer. They became friends with Amina. Mikhail started being free with Amina, telling her about his childhood life and how he came to town. But it didn't stay that way. One day, Amina said, "You're not just buying." Watching him as he looked through her items, "You're studying." Michael didn't deny it. "I'm learning," he said. She nodded slowly. "Good. Just don't wait too long to start." That made him pause, because it was true. There was a point where learning had to turn into action, and that point was getting closer. As the weeks moved, Michael's lifestyle changed in ways that weren't obvious from the outside. He still lived simply. Same room, same basic meals, with no sudden display of success. But inside, there was a structure of discipline, direction. He woke with purpose and moved with intention, spent his money carefully, and most importantly, he trusted his process. The first real step came quietly. No announcement, no big moments, but just action. Through the connections he had built, through Peter's knowledge of routes and Amina's understanding of supply, Michael secured a small batch of goods with a simple shop. Not large, not risky, just enough to begin. He didn't rush to scale, but he focused on doing it right. The first sale didn't feel dramatic. It was simple, a transaction. But when it was done, Michael didn't move immediately. He stood still for a second, holding on to the moment, because it meant something deeper. It wasn't Kimani's shop. It wasn't someone else's system. It was his, however small it was, but real. Word didn't spread fast, but it spread steadily. One customer became two became a few more. Not because he pushed aggressively, but because he delivered the same way he had learned. Accurate and reliable. No unnecessary promises. Peter helped with movement, ensuring things got where they needed to go. Amina offered quiet advice when needed, never interfering, but always sharp when she spoke. And without realizing it, Michael wasn't working alone anymore. He had people around him. Not so many, but quite enough and real ones. One evening, as they sat together at the food stall, Michael, Peter and Amina, the conversation slowed. Peter leaned back slightly. "You've changed," he said. Michael looked at him. "How?" "You don't look like someone figuring things out anymore," Peter replied. "You look like someone building something." Amina nodded slightly in agreement. Michael didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to, because he felt it too. Not fully, not completely, but enough to know it was true. That night, back in his room, the notebook was no longer filled with questions alone, but it held records, progress, small wins, mistakes that still happened, but no longer stopped him. He flipped through the pages slowly. then stopped and wrote, "It doesn't start big, but then it starts right." He closed the notebook and leaned back. The room was still simple and quiet, but it carried a different weight now. It was no longer just a place he stayed. It was part of something growing. And as he lay down, listening to the now familiar sounds of the town, one thought settled clearly in his mind. He hadn't just moved on from the shop, he had taken what it gave him and turned it into something of his own. Growth didn't arrive in a single moment for Michael. It came in layers, quiet, steady, sometimes almost invisible, unless he stopped long enough to notice it. By the time his small operation began to stabilize, his days had taken on a different kind of weight. He still woke up early, still kept his routines simple, but now every movement had consequences. If he didn't show up, something would have stalled. If he made a wrong call, it didn't just affect him, it affected the people who had started to rely on him. That realization changed him more than success ever could. At first, the money came in slowly, not enough to impress anyone, but enough to prove that what he was doing worked. He didn't rush to spend it. That was one of the first things he had learned from watching Kimani's money wasn't something you celebrated too early. It was something you controlled, something you directed carefully. So Michael reinvested. Every small profit went back into the work. More goods, better timing, slightly larger quantities, and with each cycle, the margins improved, not dramatically, but consistently. Peter became more involved without it ever being formally discussed. At first, he just helped with deliveries here and there. Then, he started planning routes more efficiently, suggesting better ways to move goods, even negotiating small costs on Michael's behalf when he saw opportunities. One evening, after a long day, Peter looked at him and said, "You know, this is not just your thing anymore." Michael understood what he meant. Then Michael asked Peter if he wanted to join the team. Peter shrugged. "I'm already among the team." They both smiled slightly. Without contracts, no formal agreement, just trust built over time. Amina's role deepened too, though in a quieter way. She never inserted herself into decisions, but when Michael came to her, she spoke with clarity that cut through confusion. "You're growing," she told him one afternoon, watching him calculate numbers in his notebook. Shen told Michael, "Don't grow blindly." Then Michael looked up. "What do you mean?" She pointed lightly at his page. "If you don't know where your money is going, it will leave you before you notice," which stayed with him. From that day, he became stricter with his records. Every expense, gain, no guessing, no assumptions. But it wasn't exciting work. But it built something stronger than excitement control. Months passed, and slowly, what had started as something small began to take shape in a way others could see. People started mentioning his name in conversations he wasn't part of. "If you need it on time, talk to Michael. He doesn't play around with orders and he's a quiet person, but he delivers." His reputation didn't come fast, but once it started forming, it moved ahead of him, which came with more opportunities and more pressure, bigger orders, tighter timelines. Situations where one mistake could undo weeks of progress. There were nights he didn't sleep much, not out of fear, but because his mind kept running, calculating, adjusting, thinking ahead. Still, he stayed grounded in what had brought him this far: accuracy, consistency, patience. And when things began to stretch beyond what the three of them could handle, Michael made a decision. He brought in more people, carefully, not just anyone. He chose those who showed the same discipline he valued, those who didn't need constant supervision, those who understood that small mistakes could become big problems if ignored. It wasn't easy at first. Some worked out, some didn't. But each experience taught him something. How to lead without losing control, how to trust without becoming careless, how to correct without breaking people. His world expanded, but he didn't lose himself in it. Then, somewhere in the middle of all that movement, he met a girl called Anjeri Sharon through Amina in a way most real things do happen. Unexpected, simple, and slowly undeniable, and not dramatic, and no sudden moment that changed everything at once. She had come by the stall one afternoon, not as a customer, but as someone helping her cousin Amina with supplies. She spoke calmly, with a kind of presence that didn't demand attention, but held it anyway. Michael noticed her the same way he noticed most things at first, quietly. But there was something different. Later, Amina mentioned her. "She's not from around here. She just came to help out. She keeps to herself mostly. Michael nodded. He didn't rush anything. Days passed, weeks passed. They crossed paths again, sometimes at the stall, sometimes along the street. Then, conversations started small. Nothing forced, just natural exchanges that slowly grew into something more. What drew him in wasn't just how she spoke. It was how she understood, never asking too many questions. But when she did, they mattered. And when he spoke about his work, his plans, even his uncertainties, she listened in a way that made him hear himself more clearly. One evening, as they walked a short distance together, she said something that stayed with him. "I think you carry a lot." Michael glanced at her. "Not more than I can handle." She nodded. "I can see that, but don't carry it alone all the time." He didn't respond immediately because he wasn't used to that, nor dismissed it either. Over time, she became part of his life in a way that felt steady, not distracting, not overwhelming, just present. And that presence grounded him in ways he hadn't realized he needed. As his work grew, so did his responsibilities. The small operation turned into something more structured: storage spaces, regular supply lines. A team that now looked to him not just for direction, but for stability. It wasn't an empire yet, but it was becoming something real, something that could grow beyond him. And in the middle of all that, one thought began returning more often. Home, Kirangi. He hadn't forgotten. He never did. But now, the memories carried a different feeling. Not just where he came from, but what he could return with. One weekend, without over-planning it, he made the journey back. The road felt familiar in a way that tightened something in his chest. The hills, the dust, the slower pace, everything he had left behind. When he reached home, nothing had changed. Everyone at home was so happy to see him. His mother's voice and his father's presence. The simple rhythm of the place, they saw it immediately. Not just that he had been away, but he had grown. Not in a way that needed explanation, but just the way he carried himself. They sat together that evening, talking in a way that didn't need to cover everything. Michael didn't speak in big words. He didn't describe everything he had built. He just shared enough, and in their quiet pride, he felt something settle inside him, a reminder that everything he was building didn't stand alone. It was connected to where he started. Later that evening, he went and checked on Mr. Kamau and was so happy to see him. They jazzed a little since he had less time. In the morning, he left them some little money for his family to use. Then he travelled back to the town. When he returned to town, he never came back the same. Came back clearer, more focused, because now, it wasn't just about growth. It was about purpose. The business continued to expand, stronger and more stable than before. With people he trusted around him and someone beside him who understood him, with a vision that stretched further than before. One night, standing outside after a long day, Peter came up beside him. "Do you remember when you used to just sit and watch?" Michael smiled slightly. "I still do." Peter shook his head. "Not the same way." Michael looked out at the town, the movement, the life, the endless flow of it. He said quietly, "Not the same way." Because now, he wasn't just watching anymore, his part of it, building within it, shaping something that hadn't existed before. And as he stood there, one thing was certain, that this was no longer just a beginning, but the foundation of something much bigger. Something that, step by step, was turning into an empire of its own. Success didn't make noise when it arrived in Michael's life. It showed itself in small changes, the kind you only notice if you remember how things used to be. At first, it was the way people greeted him. Not just a nod anymore, but a pause, a handshake. Those who always looked for him. His name started moving ahead of him, carried in conversations he wasn't part of. Sometimes he would walk past a group and hear it mentioned, casually, like he had always been there. He never reacted to it, but he always heard it, and it always stayed with him. His days grew fuller, but not chaotic. He had learned early that being busy didn't mean being productive. So even as things expanded, more goods, more deliveries, more people, and always kept a structure, mornings were still his anchor. He checked everything himself, at least once. Not because he didn't trust others, but because he trusted his own eyes. Peter had become more than just a partner in movement. He was energetic, always talking, laughing, pushing things forward when they felt like they were slowing down. One afternoon, after they had just closed a deal that would have scared Michael a few months back, Peter leaned against a stack of goods and laughed. "Do you even realize where you are now?" he said. Michael shrugged slightly, still working. Peter shook his head. "You're different, man. Before, you used to think too much before you moved. Now you move and things follow." Michael didn't answer immediately, because part of him knew that wasn't entirely true. He still thought, he just didn't let it stop him anymore. Amina remained steady, the same way she had always been. She never celebrated loudly, never reacted with excitement the way Peter did. But when she looked at Michael now, there was a quiet approval that hadn't been there before. "You've grown into it," she told him one evening. "Into what?" Michael asked. "This," she said simply, gesturing around. "The work, the people, the movement. You don't look like you're trying anymore." That stayed with him not because she was right, but at some point, it stopped feeling like effort and started feeling like him. But growth didn't come without its weight. There were days things didn't go as planned. One delivery was delayed at the wrong time, one supplier who didn't follow through, one miscalculation that cost more than he liked to admit. Those days hit differently now, not because they broke him, but because more depended on him. There was one evening he came back later than usual, shoulders heavier than normal. Jerry noticed immediately. "You're quiet," she said as they sat together. "Just a long day," he replied. Jerry didn't press him immediately. She had learned that with Michael, silence wasn't emptiness, it was processing, so she let the quiet sit between them for a while, the soft hum of the night filling the space instead. After a few minutes she spoke, her voice calm. "You don't carry small things like that." Michael exhaled slowly, leaning back. "It wasn't small," he admitted. "I made a call today, and it cost us. Not enough to break anything, but enough to remind me I'm not as ahead as people think." And Jerry nodded, not surprised. "And what did you learn from it?" He glanced at her, a slight smile forming. "You always go there first." "Because that's where the answer is," she said simply. Michael looked down at his hands for a moment before speaking again. "I learned that growth doesn't remove mistakes, it just makes them more expensive." Jerry let out a soft laugh. "Then you're growing exactly how you're supposed to." That stayed with him, not because it made the mistake feel better, but because it placed it where it belonged, not as a setback, but as part of the path. The next few weeks moved quickly. Opportunities started coming from places he hadn't expected. A supplier from another town reached out after hearing about how Michael handled his operations. At first, he thought it was just talk, but when they met, it turned into something real, a partnership that would stretch his business beyond the boundaries he had quietly accepted. Peter was the first to react, as usual. "This is it," he said, pacing back and forth. "This is how things change. We're not just operating here anymore." Michael didn't respond immediately. He had learned not to rush excitement. Instead, he asked questions, went through details, checked everything twice. But this time, there was something different. He wasn't hesitating, he was measuring and then moving. Expansion didn't come with a loud announcement. It showed itself in movement, new routes, longer days, new faces joining the team. Systems that had once worked perfectly now needed to be adjusted, strengthened, sometimes rebuilt entirely. There were moments it felt like everything was stretching at once. One afternoon, standing in the middle of it all, workers moving, goods being loaded, voices calling out, Michael paused, not for long, just a moment, and in that moment he saw it clearly. This wasn't the small operation he had started with. This was something alive now, something that didn't depend on him in the same way anymore, but still carried his decisions in every part of it. Peter walked up beside him, wiping sweat from his forehead. "You're doing that thing again." "What thing?" Michael asked, standing still when everything is moving. Michael smiled slightly. "Just checking if it's real." Peter laughed. "Trust me, it's real." That evening, Amina joined them later than usual. She had been handling part of the coordination that had grown more complex with the expansion. "You need to delegate more," she said without sitting down. Michael raised an eyebrow. I already do. Not enough, she replied. You're still holding onto the center too tightly. If this grows any bigger, it won't break because of the outside. It will break because everything still comes back to you. Peter nodded immediately. I've been saying that. Michael looked between them, then nodded slowly. All right. And that was it. No argument, no resistance, just a quiet decision. The next few days he started stepping back, not completely but intentionally, giving others room to handle things, to make decisions, even small mistakes. At first, it felt unnatural, but then something shifted. Things didn't fall apart. They adjusted. And in that adjustment, the business didn't weaken. It became stronger. One evening, much later, Michael found himself alone again, standing outside like he often did after a long day. The town hadn't changed much. Same roads, same movement, same distant sounds of life continuing. But his place in it had. He wasn't just part of the flow anymore. He was creating it, shaping parts of it in ways that reached further than he could have imagined back in Kirangi. He thought about his parents, about that quiet evening at home, about Mr. Kamau, about the version of himself who used to watch and wonder. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel it. Not pride in the loud sense, but recognition. He had come far. And yet, what stood in front of him now felt even bigger than what was behind. Jerry's words echoed in his mind again. Growth doesn't remove mistakes, it just changes their weight. Michael nodded slightly to himself, then turned and walked back inside. Because the work wasn't done, not even close. The weeks that followed didn't slow down, but they stopped feeling uncertain. Everything had found its place. The business was no longer something fragile that needed constant watching. It had grown into something steady, something that could stand on its own even when Michael stepped away. The team had expanded, but more importantly, it had settled. People understood their roles. They moved with confidence. There was rhythm in everything now. Peter still brought the energy, the noise, the push that kept things from becoming too comfortable. But even he had changed. There was more intention in how he worked, more awareness of what they were building. Amina had become the quiet structure behind everything. Where Peter pushed forward, she held things together. She saw what others missed, fixed what others overlooked, and spoke only when it mattered, which made everyone listen when she did. And Michael had stepped into something different. He was no longer trying to prove anything, not to himself, not to anyone else. He simply moved with clarity. Decisions came easier now. Not because they were simple, but because he trusted himself enough to make them. And through all of it, Jerry was there. Not in the noise, not in the spotlight, but in the spaces that mattered most. It happened on a quiet evening, not planned, not dramatic. They were sitting together, just outside, the same way they had many times before. The air was calm, the kind that made everything feel still for a moment. Michael looked at her, really looked this time, and said, "We should go see your parents." Jerry blinked slightly, surprised, not by the idea but by how simply he said it. "You're serious?" He nodded. "It's time." She studied him for a moment, then smiled softly. "All right." The journey to Kirangi felt different for Michael this time. Not like the first time he had gone back home alone, carrying thoughts he hadn't yet understood. This time, he wasn't going back to find something. He was going back to share something, to show where his life had grown into, and who he had chosen to build it with. When they arrived, the village welcomed them the way it always did, with quiet attention, with eyes that noticed everything without asking too many questions. Jerry walked beside him, calm but observant. "You grew up here," she said softly. Michael nodded. This is where everything started. Meeting her parents was simple, but it carried weight. Her father was a man of few words, the kind who watched more than he spoke. Her mother was warmer, but equally perceptive. They welcomed Michael with respect, but not instantly with ease. He understood that, so he didn't try to impress them. He didn't talk about the scale of his business, or the expansion, or the opportunities ahead. He spoke the same way he had spoken to his own parents, honestly, simply. He talked about where he came from, what he had built, what he believed in, and when the moment came, he didn't hesitate. "I'm not just building something for myself," he said. "I'm building something that lasts, and I want her to be part of it, not just beside me, but with me." There was silence after that, not uncomfortable, just real. Her father looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. It wasn't a loud approval, but it was enough. Her mother smiled, the kind that said she had already understood long before that moment. Jerry didn't say anything, but the way she looked at Michael after that, it stayed with him. When they returned to town, something had settled between them. Not excitement, not uncertainty, just certainty. The kind that doesn't need to be spoken. Time just moved forward, the way it always does. The business grew beyond what it had once been. What started as movement between towns turned into something structured: distribution, supply chains, partnerships that stretched further than Michael had ever planned in the beginning. But what mattered most wasn't just the growth, it was what grew around it. The business kids, as Peter jokingly called them, began to emerge. Young boys and girls from nearby areas, some who reminded Michael too much of himself at that age, watching, learning, trying to understand how things worked. Instead of pushing them away, Michael brought them closer. He taught them small things at first: how to organize, how to observe, how to be patient. Peter handled them with his usual loud energy, turning lessons into laughter. Amina guided them differently, firm, clear, making sure they understood discipline before ambition. And slowly, without announcement, something new formed. Not just a business, a system, a place where others could grow too. One afternoon, as the sun dipped lower and the day slowed, Michael stood watching the yard again. But this time, he wasn't alone. Jerry stood beside him. In front of them, the team moved with confidence, the young ones learning, the older ones leading, everything flowing in a way that felt natural. Peter's voice echoed somewhere in the background, arguing about something that probably didn't matter. Amina passed by, giving Michael a look that said everything was under control. Jerry slipped her hand into his. "You built this," she said quietly. Michael shook his head slightly. "No, we did." She smiled. Their wedding wasn't extravagant. It didn't need to be. It was held between both worlds, the village and the town, bringing together everything that had shaped them: family, friends, the team, the people who had watched the journey from the beginning. Mr. Kamau was there. Michael's parents sat with quiet pride. Jerry's parents, calm and assured, knowing their daughter had chosen well. Peter, of course, couldn't stay serious for long, making people laugh even in moments that were meant to be formal. Amina stood close, not saying much, but her presence said everything. And when Michael looked at Njeri that day, he didn't see the journey behind them. He saw what was ahead. Years later, the story would be told in different ways. Some would talk about the business. Some would talk about how it all started from almost nothing. Some would talk about the expansion, the opportunities, the impact. But the truth of it was simpler. Michael built something strong, not just in business but in life. He never lost where he came from. He chose the right people to walk with him. And in the end, he didn't just create success. He created a life that made sense. A life that, no matter how far it grew, always knew where it started and exactly where it belonged. The years didn't rush past Michael. They settled, not in a way that made life slower, but in a way that made it fuller. The business had grown into something people spoke about far beyond the town. What started as small, careful steps had become a structure that could carry many. New branches opened. New leaders emerged from within. Some of the young ones they had once guided were now running sections of the operation on their own. Peter still moved through it all like a storm that refused to calm down. Louder now, but wiser too. He had taken responsibility in a way no one expected at the beginning, and somehow he carried it well. Amina remained exactly who she had always been, the quiet force. People trusted her without needing to ask why. If something was stable, it was because she had touched it and Michael. Michael had learned when to step forward and when to step back. But the biggest change in his life wasn't the business. It was home. When Jerry had their first son, the first time he held his son, everything else went quiet. Not the world outside, Not the business, but inside him. The child was small, fragile in a way that made him almost afraid to move. And Jerry watched him from the bed, a soft smile on her face. "You've handled bigger things than this," she said gently. Michael shook his head slightly, eyes still on the child. "Not like this," and he meant it, because this wasn't something to build or manage. This was something to protect. They named him Kamau Jr. Mwangi, not just for tradition, but for memory, for the man who had once checked on Michael when he had nothing but ideas and questions. When Michael told Mr. Kamau, the old man didn't say much. He just nodded, his eyes holding more emotion than words could carry. A few years later, their daughter came, lively from the beginning, with a presence that filled space in a completely different way from her brother. Where Kamau was observant, always watching like Michael once did, their daughter, Wanjiku Ruth, was fearless, always moving, always asking, always pulling everyone into her world. Peter claimed her immediately. "This one is mine," he said jokingly, lifting her as she laughed. Amina just shook her head. "God help us." Home became something alive, not just a place to rest, but a place filled with small footsteps, laughter that interrupted conversations, questions that didn't always have answers. Michael found himself learning again, not about business, not about growth, but about presence, sitting on the floor after long days, listening to stories that didn't make sense, answering questions that made him pause longer than any business decision ever had. And Jerry watched him through it all. "You've changed," she told him one evening as they sat outside, the children asleep inside. Michael leaned back slightly. "I've grown," she smiled. "No, this is different." He glanced at her. "How?" "You don't carry everything the same way anymore," she said. "Before, it was all on your shoulders. Now, you know what to hold and what to let flow." Michael looked ahead, quiet for a moment. She was right. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped trying to control everything. He had built something that could move without him holding every piece, and that had made space for this. The children grew around the business the same way Michael once had. They watched. They learned. Sometimes they followed him around, asking questions about things they didn't fully understand yet. Kamau would stand quietly, observing the workers, the movement, the structure, just like his father once did. Wanjiku would run straight into the middle of everything, talking to everyone, laughing, making herself known. Peter loved it. "She's going to run this place one day," he said proudly. Amina crossed her arms. "If she does, it will be because someone teaches her discipline first." Jerry just smiled, watching it all unfold. One weekend, Michael decided to take them back to where everything had started. The journey to Kirangi felt different now, not heavy with memory, not filled with questions, but full. When they arrived, the children looked around with curiosity. "This is where you grew up?" Kamau asked. Michael nodded. "This is where I learned everything before I knew I was learning." Wanjiku ran ahead, already talking to people she had never met. Jerry walked beside him, her hand brushing lightly against his. "You brought them back," she said softly. Michael looked around, the hills, the dust, the familiar stillness that had shaped him. "I had to," he replied. "They need to know it too." They visited his parents. They visited Mr. Kamau. They sat, talked, laughed in the same quiet way that had always defined that place. But this time, it wasn't just Michael returning. It was everything he had built, everything he had become. That evening, as the sun set over the hills, Michael stood outside once more. The same place, the same view, but nothing was the same. Jerry stood beside him. Their children played a short distance away, their laughter carrying through the air. In the distance, his parents' home stood unchanged. And somewhere behind him, in another town, the business continued to move, strong, steady, alive. He didn't need to check it. He didn't need to stand in the middle of it, because he had built it right, with the right people, for the right reasons. And Jerry slipped her hand into his again. "You're quiet," she said. Michael smiled slightly. "Just looking." "At what?" He took a slow breath. "At everything." Because at that moment it was clear, The journey had never just been about building something big, it had been about building something that lasts, something that holds people, something that grows beyond you. And standing there, with his past behind him and his future running in front of him, Michael understood something fully for the first time. He hadn't just built an empire, he had built a life, and in that life, he had found exactly what he had been searching for all along. Not success, not recognition, but meaning, and that was enough. Michael's journey was never just about rising, it was about remembering. From the quiet hills of Kirangi to building a life filled with purpose, love, and legacy, he stayed rooted in where he came from. With Njeri beside him, his children growing in the same values, and the people around him rising too, his success became more than his own. In the end, Michael didn't just build an empire, he built something deeper, a life that came full circle and truly meant something.